Welcome, everybody, to the Jim Masters Show Live. It's great to have you with us today. Hope everybody is doing well all around the world. This is our Entertainment Lifestyle Talk Show series, where we are bringing back the lost art of conversation with our guests and our viewers coming from an international level. Yeah, we've got incredible viewers who call themselves the Lovities because they love the show so much. They're part of our Lovity squad. And they chime in from literally all across the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, Asia, New Zealand. We got it covered, and it's nice to see all of you. This is our second show of the day today. We were actually on earlier in the day, around 12:45 Eastern time, and it was nice to see everybody. We had viewers tuned in from Ireland and Brazil, as well as the Netherlands and South Africa, and Italy and Spain and Canada, and of course, all across the United States. I'm your host, Jim Masters. If you're joining us for the very first time, we do welcome you. This is our Entertainment Lifestyle Talk Show series, where again, we're bringing back the old school way of doing talk shows. Think Johnny Carson, Dick Cavett, Merv Griffin, Mike Douglas, the old school, warm, welcoming, conversational approach, and blending in the modern vibe and modern twist of today. We always have a good time. We always learn something new, and we always get entertained along the way. And I think that's really, really perfect. As we always do on the Jim Masters Show Live Entertainment Lifestyle Talk Show series, we always toast everybody in style. It is Friday. It's the end of the work week. Although when you work in television and radio broadcasting and stage, there's never an end to the work week because we have two shows tomorrow, and I'm on again on Sunday with pleasure because we love it. So we toast everybody watching all around the world. Sip, sip. And we say thanks for joining us here on the Jim Masters Show Live. I see all the comments already here. This is very viewer interactive, viewer centric broadcast. For those who are watching for the first time, we started this series almost a year ago. I'd say the end of April, May will be about 300. I think today you guys said we've done about 365 episodes live for 7 days a week for about a year now, just about a year at the end of April, early May, which is really extraordinary. That's pumping out a lot of content and a lot of amazing shows. And as you guys know, this is in conjunction with or sort of plays off my professional work as a television and radio personality, presenter, host, journalist, actor, writer, producer, stage MC, voiceover artist, which I've done for a long time, and love the work that I do. As they say, do what you love what you do. And we've got an amazing guest who is joining us live from Los Angeles in just a second. Renowned and esteemed legal expert, on-air correspondent, law professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, and author as well. He's penned an extraordinary and very deeply inspiring and moving book that we're going to share with you in just a second. First, let's take a quick hello and welcome some of our amazing viewers, as they're called, the Lovities around the world here. We welcome everybody. Karen is here from Nova Scotia, Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. And she says, hello, Jim, and to my wonderful Lovity family. And it's raining buckets where you are in Nova Scotia at the minute. Well, hopefully the rain will go away and you don't lose power. Good to see you, Karen. And Maureen is here. And Karen says in Arizona, where she is sort of in the desert, they got the rain, which is kind of nice there in beautiful Arizona. And Maureen also says, who works in the healthcare field. Hello again, Jim. Hope you got a chance to eat lunch. We got a chance to eat a quick meal, and we walked along the coast, which was really nice. We're, again, in the greater New York area here, between New York and Boston, along the southern New England coast. So we got a chance to do a nice jog around the coast before today's show. Happy to be here again. It will surely be a great conversation with Mr. Goldman. Absolutely. I'm sure you will have recognized him from television, many years on television as a legal expert. He's still called upon as well for his expertise, but he's got a wonderful career as a professor teaching young minds at Loyola Law in LA. Willie's watching in the Netherlands, and she goes, here we go again. We're being spoiled. 2 shows in one day. Absolutely, Willie. Glad you were here watching in Holland. Crystal is in Connecticut. Hi, Jim and everyone. Happy Friday. Hope you're having a fantastic day. Looking forward to an exciting show with inspiring conversation. You know it. And, of course, the famous Lovity. Kathy's in Cleveland, Ohio, USA. And Kathy says, happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to the weekend. You got it. That's right. Happy Passover, actually, to everybody celebrating Passover. Started this weekend is Passover, and then followed by Good Friday next Friday, and then Easter weekend. Boy, that came fast, huh? Didn't it seem like it was just Valentine's Day 10 minutes ago? So we wish everybody a blessed and happy Passover, celebrating this weekend here. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the weekend. Kathy Short again. Mary Bishop is in Florida. Beautiful and sunny Pine Island, Florida. Hello, Jim and lovely friends. Great to have that pop-up show earlier. I'm glad you enjoyed that. Willie is saying hello to everybody. Everybody's chiming in. I love how everybody's so interactive. We've got a very interactive show that and wonderful community we've created internationally here. Juanita in South Africa. Hi, Jim and Lovity Squad. Good to see you, Juanita and Gabriella. And hi, Jim and Lovities again. Merlin watching in Canada and Interkip. And welcome to all the Lovities as well from Willie there in the Netherlands. Cool. From Washington, D.C., Cynthia Catherine Howard is here. Good evening, Jim and lovely friends. Good evening to you as well, Cynthia, in our nation's capital. We love when you are here as well. And Kathleen Walker is here from New York City. Hey, Jim, nice to see you again. Hi, everyone. Good to see you as well. And Willie is here. She says this is show number 366 for her. Can you imagine we've done that many shows? 7 days a week since late April, early May. I can't believe it. Good to see everybody. Gary Troyer is here as well. We're so happy that Gary is here and Kathleen is here. Everybody's here. Keep those comments coming as we get ready to welcome together our extraordinary guest. And again, somebody who knows the law inside and out, but is a great broadcaster as well and called upon. You may have recognized him from years on television for his expertise. Tell you a little bit about his extraordinary background and this extraordinary book we're going to talk about in just a second. Stan Goldman is a tenured professor of criminal law and evidence law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, California. He covered the Scott Peterson trial, O.J. Simpson, Michael Jackson, Timothy McVeigh, who was the Oklahoma bomber, of course, those trials, as well as the Clinton impeachment, working with CNBC, CBS, King World, and Fox News Channel as their on-air legal correspondent and the network's sole legal editor. He's appeared as an expert on Entertainment Tonight 25 times, O'Reilly 40 times, Hannity 20, as well as the trade papers, People Magazine 36 times. In addition, he spent a couple of years as a special correspondent for the New York Daily News newspaper, which published about 90 of his stories. In fact, he's so accomplished that he has been immortalized by the popular Doonesbury comic strip as well. Among his many accomplishments, Stan Goldman has become the founding director of the study of law and genocide. Today, as the son of an Auschwitz survivor, and at a time when a significant rise in anti-Semitic attacks is happening in the United States, if not around the world, and you can see it in the news, he has chosen to write a book about the subject of Holocaust, detailing his mother's experience. Those experiences are riveting. Published by Potomac Books, an imprint of the University of Nebraska Press, with audio, have been purchased by Recorded Books. He's offering the opportunity to read this book, and he's going to share some passages from the book as well. He outlines a piece of the history of the Holocaust, the grim reminders of inhumanity, appearing virtually on every page, telling his mother's remarkable story about the perpetrators of the atrocities and condemning those who profiled or profited, in this case, by the success of the Nazi war machine and the labor of Jewish slaves. We're going to talk about this and so much more. Really incredible conversation from somebody who, again, has learned about it all firsthand. And I want to show you the cover of the extraordinary book because you're going to want to get it. He's going to share passage or two from the book as well. Left to the mercy of a rude stream. That's right. The bargain that broke Adolf Hitler and saved my mother. That's incredible. Riveting story. And again, we've got some wonderful pictures here we're going to be showing throughout. There's one right there. I just wanted to show you right at the outset. But let's welcome Stanley Goldman to the Jim Masters Show live exclusively from Los Angeles, California. Stan, welcome to the show. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you joining us tonight.
I appreciate being on. It's already been fun just talking with you before we got on the air. It's going to be a nice conversation, I suspect.
I look forward to it myself. So let's talk a little bit about your background early on. What was it about law that inspired you, that sort of spoke your name, was in your DNA to pursue law early on as a career, Stan?
I don't know. I was talking about, I used to watch a lot of TV as a kid, and maybe TV that was too grown up for me, in fact, because I remember watching all those Perry Mason episodes and movies with, about trials, criminal trials. And I remember I talked so much about becoming a criminal trial lawyer one day that I actually was given, talk about nerdy, I was given a briefcase for my 10th birthday by a relative. My mother's actually only surviving relative. I was given, other than myself, was given a briefcase by her for the day when I became a lawyer. I still have it upstairs. I haven't used it. It's very small, but I was 10. But yeah, so there was just something about it. I don't know what it was. I think I had thoughts of even becoming an actor back in those days, only because I thought it would be really cool to play one of those lawyers on TV or in the movies. But then as I grew up, I couldn't figure out between the two which I wanted more. Did I want to be the actor playing the role, or did I want to be the lawyer living it? And I finally decided I went to law school and I got out, and the first thing I did was do something, shall we say, unusual, which was I didn't seek jobs at big law firms. I wasn't a bad law student. I maybe could have gotten a job at some big law firm, but instead I went to work for the LA County Public Defender in downtown Los Angeles, where I spent 8 years. But the first week I was a public defender, I'd already started teaching. I'd been offered a part-time teaching job, in which I did for the 8 years I spent as a public defender, until the school finally just said, well, why don't you just come on as a tenured professor? And that with the break for doing journalism for a number of years in the middle is what I've been doing ever since.
That's incredible. So the television part of it is quite exciting and can be grueling sometimes, especially when you're covering, extensive trials and things of that nature. When did you, obviously getting, the law degree and all, when did you first dip your feet into the world of broadcast media?
I still don't know. Well, I did it. I've been doing small things around Los Angeles. You have a case in Los Angeles or some major trial, you call on a local criminal law professor to do it. I'd also had the advantage of having tried murder cases in the very, courthouse and courtrooms that many of the big trials like OJ were taking place in, so that I get called on, but it was minimal. And then oddly enough, and I still don't know why they called me. I still don't know. I never asked, really. I got a call from the New York Daily News years ago saying, we're interested in getting a legal, column published every Sunday. Would you be interested? We were referred to you, and I still don't know by who. Would you be interested in writing it? And I said, oh yeah, sure, why not? So I started writing this weekly Sunday column for them with my little picture, they have in the New York Daily News. And the OJ case came around soon after that. And they said, well, could you write something like every day for us for the first couple of weeks of the trial? And I said, yeah, sure. And that just continued on during the course of the case and the trial. And I remember one day I got a call from CNBC, and they said, look, we noticed from your byline in the New York Daily News, you're actually in Los Angeles. And I said, yeah. They said, how far are you from the courthouse? I said, 15 blocks. That's where the school is located. And they said, well, would you like to come on and do some stuff with us? And I said, yeah, sure, why not? And that began a few thousand appearances I think I had on CNBC before the end of the OJ civil and criminal trials in reverse order. And then after I'd done that for a while, the Fox News channel was about to start. I got a call from them saying, would you be interested in being our legal correspondent? And, and they offered me some pretty good money compared to what I was making. And I said, well, sure, let me find out if the school will let me do it. So the school didn't take my tenure away when I did it. So worked out nicely for a number of years.
That's incredible. So, did you enjoy the broadcast background and being involved in it? I mean, obviously, the hours can be crazy, and you never know how long you're going to be covering certain trials and certain events. But was it a bug that sort of bit you early on?
No, it was pretty good. Having been a public defender, I followed a rule that was rare amongst lawyers, and I tell this to my students. There was an evangelist in LA in a bygone era named Billy Sunday, and he used to say that no souls were saved after the first 20 minutes. So you had to get him with it. So I always kept my closing arguments in any number of I probably had 70 jury trials when I was public defender. I always kept my closing arguments very short, sort of wanting them to want more. And that was my style. So it sort of prepared me for the idea of writing for the Daily News and doing TV news, because you have to be as concise as possible to get the information out. And so it wasn't a bad preparation for that work.
What was it like when you were assigned to cover the O.J. Simpson trial? What was that like for you?
Well, it was, I knew some of the lawyers involved in the case, obviously, and the judge, in fact, and I had gone to college together. Lance Ito, he was a good friend of another friend of ours, a friend of mine, and who I'd known all through college, and as I said, I'd tried cases in that courtroom myself, so it just seemed like old home week. And my style of analyzing it was just as if I was one of the lawyers. If they'd asked me, I'd be the prosecution or defense. I'd done both in my life, and it just seemed to fit in with my background. It was a good place to start for me. I will say that I once had look, I most of my clients were obviously guilty. I mean, people who think they're going to go out and become criminal defense lawyers only defend innocent people. Either I have to live on a trust fund or do something else for a living.
Right.
I mean, I did represent some people who didn't do it, but they weren't many. So the idea of OJ getting a fair trial was important to me. I also had no doubt in my mind he was guilty once I'd heard a little of the evidence. And I remember one day getting somebody who I met had dated OJ in a prior era and had still spoken to him and said, OJ speaks very highly of your commentary. He really thinks you're fair and he likes you. And I found that to be an extraordinarily depressing moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was
the thumbs up. Yeah,
to get the thumbs up from OJ. But yeah, so it was good. It got me in. It was an interesting thing to do. I'm not entirely certain I'd still be alive if I kept doing it at the same pace, because I would literally be on the air till 11:30 at night and then back on the air at 5:30 or 6 the next morning for months and months and months. It was actually very grueling. I remember once there was a broadcaster in LA named Steve Edwards, and I was on the so I was on the morning show. It was when I was covering
KTLA Channel 5?
KTLA Channel 5, and they would they were a Fox affiliate, and since I was covering for the Fox News Channel, I would also do them every morning during some trials. The Scott Peterson trial, which for those of you too young to remember, was a murder trial about 16, 17 years ago in California that had a lot of national, even international coverage. And I remember I was on the Steve Edwards show, and he at one point, I think he just had extra time to kill. He had asked enough questions about the trial. He said, "Stan, I've been watching all the coverage of this case, and I see so many lawyers who were apparently just sitting in on the trial, and then they come on for an interview or so with some channel, and I've seen so many different ones. How can they afford to be there? Don't they have work to do? How can they come down to Redwood City and watch this trial to comment on it?" And I said, I remember, and probably the worst thing I ever said on live television, but I'll repeat it for you now. I said, "Yeah, some days I feel like an old hooker at a Paris Hilton party. There's just too many people around here willing to do my job for free." I said, "They don't realize that it is now 7:15 in the morning, and you're my third television shot of the day, And I was on last night at like 11 o'clock before I could get to bed. They don't realize this is actually not a fun gig. This is
Right.
actually very hard work.
Right.
And I'm not getting much sleep, and I'm eating terribly, and my cholesterol numbers are
Just shooting
shooting
through
to
the
the
roof.
roof. And so, yeah, it was a great job to have. I still wouldn't mind doing it, but I think if I'd kept doing it at that same pace, I don't know if I'd be here.
How do you, when you're covering it all and you're in the thick of it, maintain not the composure because you're a professional, but not get too deeply involved in it emotionally when you're hearing some of the details of a trial, or you're just seeing what's going on in the courtroom and it just gets really tough and really intense sometimes? How do you, obviously somebody who has feelings and, you're human like the rest, how do you separate that out and detach, or do you not?
I do and I don't. It's not, unless you're a psychopathic personality, I don't think it's possible to completely detach yourself. I remember I was covering the OJ trial, and I was being paid daily by CBS Network News. I would go in 4 days a week and spend about 3 hours and 15 minutes on radio air, 4 days a week, discussing the OJ trial, and it on the network CBS, not
Yeah.
the local affiliate in Los Angeles.
Right.
And I was also writing for the New York Daily News and appearing on doing CNBC. But the CBS gave me a pass to get into the trial. Now, I couldn't go very often, and I remember it wasn't until the trial was probably in its second or third or fourth week or something that I was able to get in for the first time. And I get to the front door of the courtroom. I show them my press card. It's got my name on it, Stan Goldman. They go, oh, they take me and they tell me where to sit. So I get to sit down in this like second or third row. I think it was the second row of the courtroom. It's my first time in there. I'm looking around, and all of a sudden, nice lady taps me on the shoulder, who's sitting just to my left. And I go, hi. And she said, oh, you're Stan Goldman, aren't you? And I said, yeah. She said, oh, my husband and I watch you on television all the time about the trial. We were wondering, your last name is Goldman, and my husband's last name is Goldman. We were wondering if we might be related. And I froze. I froze. I was sitting next to Ron Goldman's parents. They'd seen my name, Goldman, at the door, and they'd put me with the family of the victim who was killed. And I was kind of frozen. And but to her side was her daughter, the sister of Ron Goldman.
Yeah.
And I couldn't quite take my eyes off of the family as the trial started. And sure enough, just a few minutes into the trial that day, of all things, they put up autopsy pictures of Ron Goldman. And his sister, who was sitting one person down from me next to her mother, she brought her eyes down. How could you look? She brought her eyes down, and she pulled something out of her purse, and I couldn't help stopping myself from looking, and it was a picture of Ron from like high school or college. And I wrote a column on it for the New York Daily News saying that, I had spent so long, thinking about the details of the trial and the pros and cons and the defense and the evidence. I often neglected the families who were sitting here and who this really was, life and death to them, a story of it. And she was looking down at the pictures she would rather remember, and I had to return my view to the pictures I was there to observe and comment on. So you sort of just, you feel it, but you have to go on with your work and not let it, interfere with, what I was doing, which was trying to report on the day. And oddly enough, I wrote a column about that particular incident with the family and watching the sister. And my stories usually ran on about page 3 to page 6 in the New York Daily News. One time they actually put my story on the front page. But But this story ran on like page 36 or something. It was the furthest back they ever put a story of mine on in the 2.5 years I wrote for them, because it didn't really relate to the trial. It was kind of a personal experience, and they didn't think it was quite as much newsworthy as the other stories I was writing. But to tell you the truth, as I look back on those 90 stories I wrote, that's the one I remember most. That's the one I would pull out and read if I wanted anybody to hear something I'd written for them.
Incredible. Thanks for sharing that with us too. Then, of course, you also covered the Michael Jackson trial, right?
Yes. I covered 2 Michael Jackson trials. I'm one of the few people who ever watched Michael Jackson testify, because Fox had sent me to cover a civil trial in Santa Maria, in which Michael Jackson was being sued for like $40 million. And there were only a handful of us there because nobody really expected Jackson to show up, but he did. He walked in and he testified, and he looked like someone from another universe. I mean, seeing him on camera is one thing. Seeing him in person with all the plastic surgery at the time was very different. He looked very otherworldly, with a huge chin with a cleft, and his hair and the way his face had been redone. But so I watched him testify, and he, of course, never testified during the child molestation trial, which, by the way, took place in exactly the same courtroom as did the civil trial that he had testified in. So I watched both of them. Yes.
So what was
sat
that?
next to Janet Jackson a few times in the Jackson trial. Remarkably beautiful woman.
Absolutely. What was that like being there? I mean, obviously, there was some spectacle to some of it as well, but just the worldwide attention on some of these trials is extraordinary. Does the worldwide attention ever get in the way of the process from your vantage point?
Well, I think it got in the way of the process just in terms of the OJ trial, for example, the ones that have been on television. I always thought some of the witnesses were playing to the camera audience, depending on who they were, both either prosecution or defense. Defense didn't put on many witnesses, so we're generally dealing with prosecution witnesses. In the Michael Jackson trial, I'll tell you, the trial hadn't started yet. I was up there for one of the arraignment days, one of the pretrial motion days, and I was just doing my report when Jackson walked out of the courtroom in the garb that he'd worn to court that day. He looked, I remember saying, and he just walked out, and there was this massive crowd of people, Jackson fans and people who weren't Jackson fans and reporters. It was just so jammed. It was very early in the proceedings, and there were a lot of people there, and they knew Jackson was going to be there, so there were always a lot of people there to see him. And he goes walking right past me, and he jumps on top of the hood of a car and then onto the roof of the car and starts doing this kind of dance while, entertaining the crowd. And I happen to have the mic in front of me. I'm broadcasting live. So I'm talking about, Michael Jackson up there in what looks like a dress uniform of a Montenegro officer, playing to the crowd, with the crowd screaming at him. And it's got more going on here in terms of people watching this than the entire 9 months of the OJ trial, in terms of the spectacle, the outlandish spectacle of the defendant in this case on the top roof of a car, doing this dance for the crowd. And so I was actually the guy covering that, just by the luck of the fact that I had the mic in my hand and I was reporting on the trial when it was going on. But that trial contained one of probably the 2 most stunning moments I'd ever experienced in a courtroom. And what happened in that trial was more a kind of an inside the beltway for a lawyer. It was one day, and the complaining witness in the case, a young boy who had charged Jackson with molesting him, was on the stand, and the Tom Mesereau, who was the criminal defense lawyer, who ended up doing the trial. At the beginning, it was Mark Garagos, and then Mark Garagos was let go. The famous Mark Garagos, who'd done the Scott Peterson trial as well, and by the way, was a former student of mine. and Tom Mesereau, very fine, if somewhat grim, very fine criminal defense lawyer, was doing the trial, and he was doing cross-examination of this 13-year-old boy, I think he was at the time, the complaining witness in the case, the alleged victim. And the boy had given this testimony for the prosecution about what Jackson had done to him, what he claimed he'd done. And then Mesereau got up and he questioned for a little while. And then he said to me, the most startling question I've ever heard a knowing, knowledgeable criminal defense lawyer asked. He said, well, what do you think of Michael now, today? And the answer was, I hate him. And of course, what did you expect him to say? I mean, but then Mesereau asked one more question that either you'd only ask if you were a fledgling who knew nothing about trying cases or a truly supreme and experienced trial lawyer. He said, why do you hate him? I mean, never ask the victim in the case or any prosecution witness why, because the laws of evidence allow them to answer with whatever answers your question. They could talk about, things from Michael Jackson's life 20 years before. They could talk about anything they want. You ask a why question, you're going to get it just right back between the eyes. But the boy paused and said, because he stopped talking to me. And at that moment, I knew the trial was over. The prosecution would never recover from that response. Instead of saying, because he molested me, he said, because he stopped talking to me. When I asked Mesereau after that, how did you have the nerve to ask that question? I mean, no normal criminal trial lawyer would ever dare ask that question. And he said, how much harm could it do me? He'd already, gone through the details of the allegations against my client and what he said Jackson had done to him. How much more could it hurt me? And I figured I had a chance of getting an answer that would help. And turned out it was a miraculous answer from the defense point of view. I'm not saying Jackson was innocent or guilty or the boy was not telling the truth or telling the truth. But trials are a funny dynamic of their own. And that response was very damaging, I felt, and was a big win for the defense team.
Incredible.
The only other moment I've ever been in a courtroom where I felt I experienced something as startling was in the Timothy McVeigh trial. If you want to hear it, it was.
I had asked about that when you and I were chatting before you went live. Is there one that particularly stands out? And the Timothy McVeigh. Yeah, feel free to share that. I'd love to.
Well, there was a young prosecutor handling the case, young federal prosecutor, because it was a bombing of a federal building, so it was in a federal court. The trial judge who'd been brought in specifically to try this. Remember that the case was taking place in Denver when the incident had taken place in Oklahoma City, because the trial judge in Oklahoma City had said, well, yeah, we can try the case here. And there's no problem with me being the trial judge. The minor difficulty or flaw in that judge's decision was that his own office had been blown up in the explosion. Well, so it went up to the Court of Appeal, the circuit court, and the court said, we don't have any doubt you could be fair, but that's not the standard. There's a certain inference here that the public might question about you having been a victim yourself, sitting as the jurist in the case. So we're going to take the case away from you. We're going to appoint a new judge, and we're going to send it to a completely different state to be tried, so no one can complain about this. So I ended up getting to eat the food in Denver, which is very good, as opposed to Oklahoma City, which in my opinion is not quite the same fare. But they appointed an absolutely brilliant judge who was as good with the rules of evidence as any judge I've ever seen. Complicated rules of evidence. I've taught evidence since I was 26. I've been a law professor of evidence since the semester I got out of law school. It was my favorite class, the one I did best in. I've been teaching it ever since. They would be these complicated evidentiary objections, and Maish was the name of the judge. He would give instantaneous responses, yay or nay, sustained or overruled. And I'd have to sit there as an evidence professor going, no, Oh yeah, he's right. But his answers were like that. And the young prosecutor handling the case, I don't know whatever happened to him. His name is Merritt Garland.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
he at one point called Mcveigh's sister to the stand. Mcveigh had conversations with his sister that the prosecution had wanted to get out, and she had been threatened with prosecution for treason and some other things, and she was testifying for the prosecution. And at one moment, there was some particularly damning evidence about what Timothy Mcveigh had said to his sister. Apparently, she didn't know, but very clearly in anticipation of blowing up the federal courthouse. And she described it. But as she described this conversation with her brother, she looked at him longingly with a great sisterly affection, and he looked at her smiling as her testimony, in my opinion, put him in the gas chamber. And I knew that at the moment she was providing arguably the most damning evidence for the premeditation. Not that they might not have been able to prove it otherwise, but it was the single most damning evidence I'd yet heard at the trial. And it was coming out of the mouth of his sister as she smiled and looked directly at him, and he smiled and looked directly back at her. No animus on his part, because he knew this was how she was going to get out from underneath the potential prosecution. But the expression on their faces, which was not being broadcast, so nobody else, unless you were in the courtroom, could see it, and the look was chilling, because it was just, if you knew the case, you knew this is a big deal, and it was just as astonishing a moment as I've ever seen in a courtroom.
Mm-hmm. Are there cases that you wish you were a part of? Some of these big ones. Jeffrey Dahmer, any of these others?
I didn't long for big time cases when I was trying things. I had a case once that had gotten some considerable publicity. I remember continuing it, managing to figure out how to keep the case continued for about a year so the publicity would die down. So finally, when it got to trial, there wouldn't be much of, I don't think there was any press attention to it. It had died away. My client had, while on heroin, had crashed into a gas carrying truck, and it had exploded and had blown away a segment of the Pomona Freeway. And the one thing they had to close the Pomona Freeway, which is this huge freeway in the greater Los Angeles area. They had to close it to make these structural repairs and rebuild it. So the last person I wanted on the jury, that was picking the jury, was anybody who lived in that area, because if they had to drive back and forth, their days had been ruined for I don't know how long while they were repairing it. But no, there are plenty of cases. People ask me, how could I defend these people? I wrote an article about it once. And in my opinion, there's a lot of good reasons to knowingly defend guilty people, because if you don't knowingly defend guilty people, how do you really defend innocent people? Because there are plenty of trials I had where I had thought when I started it, my client might be innocent, but by the time I got to the end, I realized they were guilty. But the reverse was also true. I started criminal trials in which I was personally convinced, given the evidence I was given, statements from witnesses, that my client had done it. And yet by the end of the trial or the middle of the trial, I realized, son of a bee, I'm representing an innocent guy. Damn, I hate representing innocent people. There's so much pressure. Give me an innocent guy anytime. All right, you lose the case. But an innocent person, you're the only thing between them and a horrible miscarriage of justice. I felt like Napoleon did from St. Helena. Sometimes thinking back on those cases, my mistakes haunt me, is what he said. My mistake. And if you're representing a person you believe to be innocent and you lose that, your mistakes haunt you forever. I know that I've consulted in a few cases involving, high profile. I would say that the Scott Peterson trial, for those of you who remember it, I was in a very odd position. I was covering the trial on a daily basis, and I even had to teach a course a semester during portions of the trial. I'd literally get out of bed in the hotel room in the morning, cover the trial. I had an evening class that semester, luckily. jump in my car, race to the airport, fly to LAX, get out of my car, teach my class from 6 to 8, jump back in my car, drive back to the airport, get on the last flight back to Northern California, go to bed, and get up in the morning and do the trial again. But that was an interesting trial for me to cover because the lead defense lawyer was a guy named Mark Aragos, who I've already mentioned, had been an evidence student of mine. The lead prosecutor was a wonderfully nice guy named Rick DeStasso. They both, DeStasso, very, very fine guy. And he had been a student of mine in my criminal procedure class some years earlier. And so I knew the head prosecutors in both, the head prosecutor and head defense lawyer. And because I'd been their professor, I don't know if I've ever said this before, every once in a while, I'd get an email question about law from either or both, of them. And I would just, as a professor, as their former professor, write them, the legal answer, and I'd never mentioned this to the press, but it was kind of an interesting way to cover a trial where you've got, sort of access to both sides because you had taught them. So it was that was as strange a position as I've ever been.
Has there ever been a tug, within your heart between teaching law and being involved in it from the university level as an esteemed professor and the covering of it as the on-air correspondent broadcaster? Are you always still that renowned law professor who happens to be covering the trial, or are you the covering the trial correspondent who is also the law professor? Has there ever been a tug between the two?
Sure. Well, there was a tug in the years when I had to, I was still with Fox, but would still be teaching somewhat at Loyola. So there was always a timing tug in terms of trying to, I had to turn down plenty of interviews because right in the middle of class, but there were a number of occasions when literally the camera crew would be waiting for me for the 10-minute break in the 2-hour class where I'd take a 10-minute break. I'd go out, I'd do the interview, and then I'd come back in and teach the second half, or they'd be waiting for me, as soon as class ended to come out and do it. So I remember one time I actually arrived in class with I literally was doing a studio shoot. It went longer than I thought. I jumped in my car, raced to class. I'm teaching class, and I realized I haven't taken off my studio makeup. Oh, geez. I hope the students don't notice. But yeah, there's a bit of a tug, but it was handy in the sense that it would give me daily illustrations occasionally for problems in class. Teaching criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence, and legal ethics, which were the primary classes I taught for many years and still teach. There would be plenty of illustrations right out of the headlines of some major trial. And since I was for a, dozen year period, maybe 13 years, since I was covering all the major trials, I was even Fox News. I remember Roger Ailes himself put me in charge of the legal coverage of the Clinton impeachment. Although I didn't go to DC, I did it either from LA or from New York for periods of time. Because he specifically said, I want to be, maybe think this is impossible for Roger Ailes to have said, but I want to on this one be right down the middle. I think he realized this was a danger for the Republican Party. He never said that to me, that the Clinton impeachment was a danger. He said, I want somebody right down the middle, so I can't have anybody who shows their political inklings, attitudes on camera, and you're that guy. So I want you to lead the legal team on it. So yeah, that's where being a professor and speaking like a professor although I, came in handy for the news business, because even Roger Ailes was prepared to trust an old liberal Democrat like me with coverage of an impeachment, because I covered it like, objectively analyzing whatever was going on into legal terms.
As the expert in law, as you have been and continue to be all these years, how did covering the law, being there on the scene and seeing the actual, trials and hearing the different testimony and just being there in the thick of it, how did that change or enhance your understanding of the law or your ability to express it to your students? How did that add any rich textures to what you're already doing, actually being in the thick of it, as the lawyer, or as in this case, the correspondent as well?
I think it gave me more of an understanding of what the jury must be going through, because I would watch it from, an explanatory position, and realize that the jury, you're trying to get a message through the jury. And it not only, I think, taught me more about how to reach an audience, a jury, but it also reinforced for me in a very extreme way something I had felt when I was a trial lawyer and had to sit around waiting for other people to finish their case before I could do my own. And that was how bad so many lawyers are. I mean, people think a lawyer's a lawyer, people think a doctor's a doctor. No, the quality of lawyering is so dramatically different, especially trial lawyers. There are some people who are naturals at it, some people who aren't, but their preparation, their intellectual perspicacity is enough to get them over the fact they're not exactly orators. But there are also just a lot of trial lawyers out there who have no idea what they're doing. And sometimes they're even trial lawyers with high reputations who have been hired in high profile cases and are really not very good at it. They're okay when they've prepared. They're fine. That's how they get their reputation. But the problem with a trial lawyer in criminal cases, much more so than civil trials, is you don't have the kind of pre-trial discovery in criminal cases that you have in civil. You don't have what we call interrogatories, where the other side has to answer questions. You don't have the depositions of witnesses very carefully questioned. In fact, in a civil trial, you should never ask a question if you're a trial lawyer in a civil trial you don't already know the answer to. Because if you don't know the answer based on the discovery, you've done a lousy job of discovery, or you're being very reckless. But in a criminal trial, you don't have that benefit, because very often you don't know what the answer is going to be. And if you don't know what the answer is going to be, it's rolling dice, depending on how you ask that question or whether you ask it at all. And the difference for me between a decent lawyer and a really great lawyer was how they handled those moments in court when you didn't know what was coming, or something hit you out of the blue, something you didn't expect, a witness answer that clearly wasn't there before, or something you clearly weren't thinking of. So that's what sets a certain number of lawyers above the others. The ability to move, to the flexibility to get the ball when you're expecting it to go here and it goes there, to hit that curveball when you're expecting a fastball. And there were lawyers who could do that and lawyers who couldn't. And lawyers were very good if they had a prepared speech. They had their cross-examination written up, but all of a sudden, if some answer would come out of the blue and they wouldn't pick up on it, you would know this is not a lawyer who can dance, who can just handle things on their feet. They've got to be, and therefore maybe not the greatest trial lawyer I've ever seen, kind of thing.
What percentage would you say requires the theatrical side of it all when presenting a case or involved in the thick of a trial?
If you look back in history, American history, you would see that trials were theater before there was radio and television. People would go sit on the oral arguments of the Supreme Court. The audiences would be packed. It was like political speeches. They'd go and the community would come out for a murder trial or a robbery trial. I mean, there was a reason why the audience was always there are so many seats that are usually empty these days. But it was the original theater, and it has never stopped being theater. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but obviously someone who is a good communicator. When I was picking juries, there was a time when I was still picking juries when I was very young, where the trial lawyers would get to ask a ton of questions of jurors. As the years have passed, lawyers are often not able to ask any questions themselves, and sometimes they're only able to ask a few. But you were able to ask a lot of questions. I never, unlike most lawyers, I never cared about what the answers were. In fact, I had some clients say, we got to kick that person. I remember I had a trial once. My client was accused of assaulting a group of firemen in an emergency scene. And I had one of the prospective jurors who I was questioning. It turns out when he answered the question of the prosecution, his two best friends were fire commanders, like very, very high up in the fire department. And my client, who by the way was a doctor, it was a very interesting case. My client turned to me and said, after the guy admitted it, he said, "Well, you're kicking him off, right?" And I said, "I don't know. Let me ask him a couple of questions." I asked him a few just nebulous questions. And I sat down and I said, "No, I'm keeping him." He said, "What are you, crazy? His best friends are firemen." I said, "Yeah, but he paid more attention to my questions than he did the prosecutor. I like the way he looked at me. Also, he's probably got a lot of respect for firemen. And as much as I respect firemen, the firemen in this case weren't professional. And I'm going to point that out. And I think I might get him." And sure enough, he became the jury foreman and led the jury to an acquittal on my client who was charged with assaulting these firemen. Because I remember my first line of my opening statement, my closing argument. My first line of my closing argument, it's odd I still remember it, but I got up and I said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when I first saw that all the witnesses for the prosecution in this case were going to be firemen, I remember thinking to myself, firemen? Why not nuns? I mean, at least I may get somebody on the jury who went to parochial school and had a bad experience with a nun. But everyone, for good reason, loves firemen. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there are firemen. And there are firemen.
Mm-hmm.
And let's examine these particular firemen and their particular behavior in this case." And that, so, you never quite, and did the theatrics help? Yeah. Having, when I was in, I did some plays when I was at UCLA as an undergrad, in the theater arts department, which I wasn't a theater arts major, but they let me do some plays there. Sure. Would theatrical background help in the courtroom? Absolutely. I once years ago wanted to put a course together called Acting for Lawyers, but the school thought it, wouldn't quite be appropriate for students. So I thought it would be, because your demeanor, the way you respond, the tone of your voice, the eye contact, it's somewhere between being a Shakespearean actor and a shoe salesman, and that's what being a trial lawyer is.
Juanita in South Africa watching. She says, "What was the most unexpected moment ever for you, Stan? Is there one that really stands out still today?"
In a trial? No, I think it was that Michael Jackson moment where the question was, because I was so startled by that. I mean, personally, the most outstanding experience is when a client of mine tried to deck me in court. Took a swing at me and I just managed to get out of the way. You're not exactly, as a public defender, you're not exactly loved by your clients.
Right.
I remember having a client once. He was a shall we say he held a rather significant position in a local street gang in East Los Angeles. And I remember the first time I met him at the jail, he started telling me something about the case, and he just looked at me and said, "You're not going to tell anybody else anything I'm telling you, are you?" I said, "No, of course not. It's attorney-client privilege. It's confidential." He said, "You're not going to tell the DA what I'm telling you." I said, "Man, why would I tell the DA anything? He's on the other side." He said, "I don't know. Maybe someday you want to be promoted to the DA's office." And I'm right then I'm thinking, maybe I shouldn't give this guy any defense at all if he thinks being a public defender isn't as good as being a DA. But then I said, "No, I'm not going to do that." He said, "Because I may be in prison, but if I find out you're telling the DA anything I've told you, I'll have you killed."
Yeah.
And he was a high-ranking member of a significant street gang. He could have done that easily. And I said, now he's putting on a personal level. I went, "No, don't worry about it. I'm not telling anybody." But yeah, I would say getting a guy who was much bigger than I am, a client of mine, swing at me, because what had happened in the public defender's office, I won't name him, but the best trial I ever saw was a fellow who had been a public defender. He was a magnificent criminal defense lawyer. He was really great. But when he was in the public defender's office, he'd had one moment in which he was as good a criminal trial lawyer as I'd ever seen work. And his client was trying to get him fired off the case because he didn't think a public defender would do anything for him, because he didn't trust public defenders because they were appointed by the government, and he wasn't paying them. How could you trust anybody you're not paying?
Right.
And the judge looked down and said, well, Mr. Public Defender, your client says there's some sort of conflict of interest between the two of you that requires the appointment of some, panel attorney. I got to tell you, some of the panel attorneys were great. Some of them were terrible. And this defendant didn't realize he had the best criminal trial lawyer in town representing him. And he said, no, Your Honor, there is no legal, and that's a term of art that has a certain definition. There is no legal conflict of interest between my client and myself. And the client turned around and decked him, just hit him from the side before he could get out of the way, knocked him down, bleeding. His glasses were broken. And from the floor, he said, now there's a conflict. And the trouble was, that was a sort of it's not that it opened the field day, but if anybody wanted to get rid of their public defender, it got around the jail. All you had to do was knock him down,
Right.
and you could get a real lawyer.
Yeah.
So that was for me personally, that was the most startling moment in court. But if you're talking about testimony, it was that moment during the Michael Jackson trial where his lawyer asked the alleged victim, why he hated Michael Jackson. I thought that was, to me, a startling moment because it involved so much of my career of teaching law, in which I'd always told my students, until you're a really experienced trial lawyer, never ask a why question on cross-examination. Never do it. So it's a verboten thing tactically to do. And here was somebody with a lot of experience showing exactly the exception to the rule.
Extraordinary. That would be surprising. Absolutely. This is incredible. And a lot of the viewers around the world are commenting. They're saying this is incredibly interesting and I can't believe it. And one of them actually said, I bet, Karen in Nova Scotia said, I bet students are fighting their way to get into one of your classes, Stan.
I'm actually known as a rather tough professor. I would say they're trying to fight their way out of my classes because nobody wants to take my exam, because I think the reason why I'm kind of tough, although occasionally amusing, the way I'm kind of tough is because I watched so many cases in those 8 years of being a public defender, and then those almost 13 full years being a correspondent covering trials, in which bad defense lawyers would just sell their clients down the river without knowing it because they wouldn't understand the law or didn't think like lawyers, or prosecutors just didn't understand what they were saying. If you were talking to another prosecutor, that might have worked, but it's not going to work with this jury. I mean, they had no comprehension of sort of legal reasoning and the thought process of a lot of these things. And I watch that so often. I can't live with myself unless I try to impart to students what it is to be a lawyer and how to think like a lawyer. I don't know if I succeeded. I've had a lot of very successful former students that, look, one of my favorite students is now the head of DHS, Alejandro Mayorga. I texted him, we texted back and forth quite a few times after his appointment, but I've known him for many years. He was just a really nice kid.
Yeah.
We have a not unsimilar ethnic background. I don't think people realize my father was a Romanian Jew who escaped the Holocaust and met my mother in Los Angeles. She had not escaped the Holocaust. She had survived it. But Mayorka's mother was a Romanian Jew who was on a ship fleeing the Nazis. And to me, they bury the lead whenever they talk about Mayorka. His parents did flee communist Cuba to make it to the United States. But I think the lead on this is not only did his parents flee the communists in Cuba, his mother fled the Nazis out of Europe, and the ship she was on was denied the right to land in the U.S., as so many of those ships carrying Jews out of Europe were during the war, and it had to turn around, and she was lucky enough to be the ship was allowed to dock in Havana, where she met Ali's father and married. So in my opinion, that is, and by the way, there are, I don't think there's ever been a cabinet filled with as many second generation Holocaust survivors, the children of Holocaust families there are in this administration. The Secretary of State, the Merrick Garland, who tried the Mcveigh cases, our Attorney General, the head of DHS. They've reached the point at which you know they may be the last large number of Jewish lawyers going into a cabinet, but it's reached that point in which they sort of have a background not unlike mine.
Extraordinary. Tell us again about some of the amazing students that you've had of note that may trigger some memories for folks past and present.
Oh, well, most of the students who are lawyers of mine are only known to the legal community. I had a former research assistant, lovely girl who was now mayor of Oakland. A lot of people go on to careers and other jobs as well. But and I've had, I've been teaching since I was 26, and I've taught every year since then. Even if I was in the media, I maintained my tenure by still continuing to teach at Loyola. And I will say this as an aside, I'm going to sound like a grump. One of the things I don't like about television legal analysis is that you have no idea how many people will list themselves as being a law professor. That's their Chiron, professor of law. But the reality is there's somebody who was an adjunct who taught one semester somewhere years before. I mean, I've had to write, I think I've published something like over 20 law review articles, which is what you have to do when you're a tenured professor. Whereas if you're a part-time professor, that doesn't mean you've ever written a thing. It's a very different category and it just kind of bothers me that, and I've mentioned this to networks I've been on and said, that guy who was on with you, I looked him up, and that guy was never a real professor. He taught one class about 5 years ago at one law school in some little specialty, and yet you got him Chironed as law professor, and they don't want to hear it because they think it gives them more credibility to have a law professor on the air. So whenever I'm on the air these days, I always insist they say tenured professor of law on the bottom, because most of the people who are giving these opinions, they're lawyers who happen to have taught a class or two sometime.
They're not credible, right?
No, they're not necessarily credible, or at least they shouldn't be using that as a credential.
Let's talk about the book too. This is really amazing. What inspired you, Stanley, to write this book and tell this story? Left to the mercy of a rude stream, the bargain that broke Adolf Hitler and saved my mother.
Well, it's two things. One, first of all, I want people to know, I'm a law professor. I can write like a law professor if I want to. I didn't write this book like a law professor. I wrote this book like I wrote the 90 stories I had published under my name for the New York Daily News. I had originally intended this book to be read by 17 and 18-year-olds. Unfortunately, everybody who writes me nice letters about the book seems to be in their 70s or 80s instead of 17 or 18. But I wrote it. I tried to write it in a straightforward news reporter kind of style, in two different voices. One as the historian, my undergraduate degree from UCLA. Best job I ever did as a student. I was a Phi Beta Kappa in history. I really liked history. I wrote some of it as a historian of sorts. I wrote others portions of it as the son, and it's a bizarre kind of book. I don't find it bizarre, but I remember one reviewer was a professor of history, a Holocaust history, and he said I had created a new genre of Holocaust literature because this is a story told about a mother from the point of view of her son, what the war had done to her, but also talking about not only how she survived, but the politics that put her in those camps and the politics that got her out of those camps. And it's really a blend in some ways, although it's a short book. it's in a sense 3 short books that are all blended together. It's not like I have a chapter on one and a chapter on another and a chapter on another. It can vary from the history to the personal within a given paragraph, which is what took me so long to write it. I remember when I decided to write the book, I'd done a fair amount of research, and it turned out I ended up with a free semester. Still getting paid for it, but something had happened with the school schedule, and the class I was due to teach got canceled for schedule purposes, like the first day of class. And we never actually had the first day of class, and I kept waiting for the school to, like, at the last minute, assign me a completely different course. It never happened. So I ended up with, it was January, and I wasn't going to teach until August. So I thought, well, I'll sit down and write that book. How long can it take me? 6 months? I got 8 months before I have to teach again. It took me 8 years, because it turned out it took me 4 more years to do the research, and then 4 more years to blend what was basically 3 books into what I thought was a coherent, smooth, one volume. And I wrote the book in many ways just for myself, because it wasn't until my mother had never known how she was saved. My mother was saved. My mother was saved on numerous occasions during the war, and that's the way people survived the Holocaust. You had to be very lucky. You also had to be incredibly strong and clever, because if you weren't strong, you wouldn't make it to the luck. And if you weren't clever, you wouldn't be able to spot the luck when it occurred. And that was my mother and the women she was with. My mother spent the entire war. Here's a picture of my mother in Sweden after the war. There's 5 other people in the picture who are Holocaust survivors, and the others are Swedish citizens who were helping, not Jewish, who were helping in the recuperation of Holocaust survivors. And that's my mother right there, the little dark-haired woman in the middle, just a little bit higher, and the woman just over her right shoulder, sitting behind her, is the woman who was her best friend, who she survived the war with. And by the way, the gentleman with all the hair, almost Einstein-like, sitting next to my mother, became the husband of the woman to her right. And he, I hopefully will be visiting in about 4 weeks, if I can get on a plane and they'll let me into Israel. He's still alive. His mind is solid. And there aren't that many Holocaust survivors still left. But yeah. My mother didn't know how she was saved at the end. She knew at the various points in her life when she was in the war, in the camps, in the factories, and that she would be saved. And she realized she was about to be killed and something would happen that would save her life. But she never actually knew the reasons why she was saved, any of the background. And that's one of the things I decided to do. And that took the most time, trying to find out, why in the world was my mother and the group of women with her? That's my mother and her friend. That's my mother with the glasses on, taken in Los Angeles when she came to visit. She lived in Israel. My mother came to Los Angeles after the war. She just knew she was saved. Literally one day she'd be, and then something would happen. And that's me and my mother before, and she was already older and I was younger. I'm so much younger now than I was then, but
amazing how that works.
Yeah, it's amazing. But so I started looking into the occasions on which my mother's life was spared, which of course allowed me to be born. And all of them had difficult and fascinating circumstances surrounding it.
Yeah.
For example, I'll just tell you, and I hope that, and the book is not a depressing book. I mean, actually, some reviewers have said that about it in print, and that is that they were surprised that even though this is a nonfiction book about the Holocaust, I intended it as an uplifting story about this group of women who survived the worst the world could ever throw at anyone. And yet came out of it and had families and had lives. So I and even during the time of COVID, it just strikes me that one thing my mother once said to me, which is going to sound, it's a very weird thing to say because you think you're making a joke, but of course it's both the most deadly serious thing ever said and also somewhat amusing. I remember when I was in my mid-20s. I was having a particularly tough time about something. I don't remember what it was. Something had gone completely wrong. I actually, to this day, I can't remember what it was. I just remember I was very depressed and I was pacing, and my mother was there, and I was so upset about something. And she said, "Stanley," this is the way she spoke, by the way. I do my mother very well. My mother had a very thick accent. She said, "Stanley, listen, it's better than being in Auschwitz." I can think of no more devastating comment than it can ever be made. And the fact that it was, it was obviously, I write in the book that it was this, from my perspective at the time, it was just another example of that generational battle of suffering. Your battle with your parents as to who's suffering more, they are or you are. And it was clearly the ultimate one-upsmanship. Nobody could make a comment like that and be one-upped by anybody in the world. And yet, it was spoken by one of the few who actually knew. I mean, it's not like anybody was saying this, just anybody. It was someone who had, my mother, just give you an example of one of the things that occurred. My mother was in Auschwitz, sitting, I say sitting, I'll explain why sitting next to her best friend there with other women around them, one of whom the women passed away years ago, but I discovered that in the archives at the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, not on computer, but an actual testimonial written out by her and a few other survivors, I found a statement from a woman who was also sitting with my mother. And where were they sitting? They were sitting on the steps to the gas chamber. They'd been in line waiting at to go into the gas chamber for days. And literally, the day I'm talking about would turn out to be 5 years later to the day, my birthday. So she's sitting there, the women ahead of her already having gone in, not going to be returning. And they'd reached the point in which they were the next to go in. They were not only in line, they were literally sitting, waiting to go in. And there was a guard. My mother's friend, Genya, and I write this in the book, she said this in an interview. I have the videotape of it. She said, we were sitting there, and I asked this Nazi guard, this woman, this SS guard, she said, what are we doing here? Said my mother's friend. And the guard, this is what my mother's friend's answer was. She said, she pointed to the crematorium and the smoke coming out. And she said to my mother's friend in front of my mother, you see that smoke? You see that chimney? You're going to go through there. And so they were about to die. And all of a sudden, they're told from the beginning of the line, 500 women are pulled out. They're given clothes to wear. They're put on a train. The train door is closed. They're in there for 3 days and 3 nights. Almost no water, no food. Barely can breathe. 3 days later, the train stops. The door opens. They're in the heart of Berlin. Mm. What the heck was she? What the heck were we doing in Berlin? I mean, my mother knew she was in Berlin, but why was she there? And the answer is they put them to work in a factory in the heart of Berlin, so that not only when the Germans weren't trying to kill her, the Allies were, because they were bombing the factories in Berlin. And my mother was put to work with the other women in a factory. And I never knew quite how that happened. And so when I did some research on it, I stumbled across the answer. The factory was in need of workers. The factory was run by SS. They had written to Auschwitz saying, we need workers, but we don't want Jews. We want non-Jews, women, because we think their hands are better for the detailed tasks they're going to be asked to perform, doing equipment things. We want women. We don't want Jews, preferably, and I still have no idea why. True, this sounds like I'm making this up. Preferably French women. That would be good. French women would be good. I have no idea what was a language issue. God knows what was going on in their heads. Gets to Auschwitz, and the guards get told, we need 500 women. And slowly but surely, as the story gets told, it goes from French women to just non-Jewish women, and then from non-Jewish women, just women, and then from just women to 500 Jewish women as the story changes with each link. So when the train door opens and the women come out, the factory suddenly discovered that it was stuck with 500 Jews, and those Jews still had their lives. So, I mean, I have probably the most esoteric, professing sounding sentence I have in the entire book is after I explain that, I say, it was not the first, nor would it be the last time that my mother's life would be spared by the serendipitous consequences of evil, which is true. The reason why my mother's life kept being spared was they needed something from them. They needed workers.
Right.
So instead of, and my mother never, and the women with her, they never had the tattoo on their arm. People misunderstand about the Auschwitz tattoos, the camp tattoos. Those were the potentially lucky ones who got the tattoos. It's a comparative thing, of course. They were intended to be kept alive to work at Auschwitz. So you had to keep a record of them, the number. If you weren't given a number, it's because they planned on killing you quickly. So my mother was not given a number, and she was taken to barracks. And to show you what the Nazis were like, the barracks had previously been occupied for a period of time, a significant period of time, by Roma, by gypsies. And the name of the word they used for barracks, that was Lager. That was the German word. So this lager was known as the gypsy lager. The Roma who'd been kept there as captives had been killed, like the day before. This particular barrack, as so many Roma were, I think something like 25,000 Roma were killed at Auschwitz. And my mother was taken to put in the gypsy barracks. That's what they're called, the gypsy lager. And then when the Germans decided they had time to do it, they took them off to kill them. That's what it was like. So my mother went through a series of these things where, digging into it to find out how she was saved was, to me, very startling. And that's quite literally, I'm not making up the title. I had 2 Holocaust scholars review my book before it was published. And that subcategory about, the bargain that broke Adolf Hitler, that saved my mother, I asked them each, the first question I asked after they finished it was, have I done enough in the book to justify the title? And they both thought for a moment and said, "Oh, yes, you did." That is a legitimate thing to say. And then I won't go into the detail as to how that is even possible, but my mother, I could read you a portion from it.
I was gonna, definitely. I was just gonna ask, through the years, did you talk about this with your mother? Was your mother open and expressive? Were you able to gather various bits of information from her story along the way as you were, coming of age?
No, with a minor asterisk, yes, at the end. My mother was not willing to speak about it until she was quite old. And when she was prepared to talk about it, and this was years ago, she'd had a stroke. Luckily, it had not affected her mind. And she was paralyzed on her left side at the end, but my mother could emotionally, seemingly survive anything. Matter of fact, she used to lay there in bed with her paralyzed left arm across her chest. And occasionally you'd walk in. And I remember one day I walked in with somebody and she kind of patted her hand that was laying across her chest and said, "My babula, I keep it like a little baby, like here on my arm." She was indomitable. There was nothing, she was just indomitable, or else she couldn't have survived. So she said, she was willing to talk about it. So I ran out and I got a Super 8 camera. It was pre-digital era. And I got a Super 8 camera just for this occasion. And I set it up in the living room and sitting on the couch. And I started recording. And my mother told me things that she'd never said before. And we had scratched the surface. We had just passed the half-hour mark. I think I'd gotten to exactly 32 minutes or something on the camera. And then she paused and said, "Are we finished now?" And I said, having just really scratched the surface, I went, "Yes, Mom, of course we are. We're done now." And I turned the camera off. But those 32 minutes that I was able to record of her, I believe you can view. I don't remember if there's a connection at the book site or not on Amazon, that there might be. And there certainly is, I believe, at the publishing house, Potomac Books. And even if you are able to navigate my school page at Loyola Law School, Stan Goldman, if you, there's my, I put the interview on my page there. You can watch that interview with my mother. And the interesting thing about it was, when I went to Yad Vashem and found 5 testimonials that had been written in like 1990 by women who'd been with my mother, not my mother, it's just they'd gotten 5 women who were in my mother's group to write testimonials out as to what had happened. And I had to get them translated. They were either in Yiddish or in Hebrew. One was actually written by a woman from America who wrote it in English, but they'd gotten 5 of them to write it. And I only found a couple of minor things I could use in the book that were new to me. What it primarily did was confirm everything my mother had said. Mm-hmm. Because in finding those testimonials written by the women who were with my mother, the stories were identical to the ones my mother had told me, from women who she had not seen since, 1945 or whatever, so you knew that they were substantial. But I remember one woman had said, who was sitting next to my mother on the steps, she said, she described where she was. So she had to be next to my mother, because that's exactly where my mother and the other women who were there had put her. And she said, "A minute later, I wouldn't be here. Hmm. If that Nazi guard hadn't come over and taken us away, that I wouldn't, another minute longer, I wouldn't be here." Which is, basically what my mother had said, and confirmed a lot of other things. But
how do you describe your mother?
Oh God.
You're obviously deeply close with each other. You could tell.
The way
you describe it, you can hear it in your voice. She meant the world.
My mother was a. There was a lot about my mother not to like. My mother was a very. The war had taught her. My mother was a very possessive woman, and from her perspective, for the rest of her life after the war, there were only 2 possible positions. You either agreed with her or you were a Nazi. So she was not always the easiest person, but she had there was something about her. I have a professor who just retired from Loyola, a brilliant professor, Jan Costello. She'd been she was a Yale. She was a Yale undergrad, Yale master's, Yale law, brilliant professor. And she wanted to meet my mother. So one day I took her over to meet my mother. And she spoke for a few minutes to my mother, and then we walked out, and Jan suddenly kind of almost faltered. She almost, it looks like her knees were buckling. And I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I've never experienced anything like that in my life." And I thought she was talking about, we didn't talk about the Holocaust. They were just, talking pleasantries. And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What happened?" And she said, "Your mother, it was almost supernatural. I could feel in talking to her, there was a kind of aura around her. I don't know how to explain it." She said, "I once had that experience before with one other person when I was very young, but I don't know how to explain it. But there's just something about her. There was a certain, I don't know, charisma about my mother that I think had been brought about by having gone through such a cauldron and having lost so much, that there was, she was 4'10", 4'11". It was hardly, she was, at her heaviest, she was like 91 pounds. But there was something about my mother that was quite charismatic, and I think was also true for some other survivors. You didn't come out of that unless you had a deeply strong psychological personality, as well as, I think, something that's never been written about. I'm trying hard to think of I grew up in a community of survivors. When I was a kid, all my mother's friends, All my parents' friends were survivors. All their kids were the kids of survivors. That's who I played with. That's who we'd have Passover with. That's who we'd have, we go to the house, we go to the beach with somebody. It was always somebody who was a survivor. And I only thought about it years later, but I never knew a single survivor who wasn't a physical freak. I mean, they'd be 5'4" men who could, they could carry a couch out by themselves to a truck if they needed it. They didn't survive. And my mother, she was paralyzed on her left, but she still had her right arm. And I never put her in a home anywhere. I kept her in her own apartment, and she needed caretakers to take care of her. And I usually hire large women to take care of her because they'd have to pick her up and put her in a wheelchair. And I remember I heard this one woman. She's much bigger than me. She was maybe 2 inches taller than me and heavier and strong woman. And she turned to me once. I'd come over to see my mother. I didn't live with my mother. I had my own place. She had her own place, obviously. And I came over, and this woman, for no particular reason, I was just walking out of my mother's room, and she just was shaking her head. And I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Your mother's the strongest person I've ever met in my life." And I thought she meant emotionally, that she's able to handle this and still have this kind of humorous, my mother could be very funny. She could still be this, comedian in spite of everything that had happened to her in life. And I thought that's what she's saying. And I said, "Yeah, she's got this strong, personality." And she, no, I mean, physically. Now, my mother was like 86. She'd been in bed for 5 years, unable to move, no exercise, no nothing. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "This morning I was going to be busy cooking, and I wanted to take your mother to the bathroom. And so I started to pick your mother. I said, what are you doing?" Your mother said to me. I said, "I'm going to take you to the bathroom." She said, "I don't need to go." She said, "Well, it's better if we go now. Maybe you'll need to go later. Better we get it out of the way now." And she said, "I don't need to go to the bathroom." She said, "Just let me do this." She said, "No." And so I picked your mother up to take her anyway. And she said, "Your mother took her right hand, the only one she could use." Mine is 4'10" woman, weighing 90 pounds, been in bed for 5 years, unable to move really. She said, she put her hand on the muscle of my left arm as I tried to lift her. And I felt as if someone had taken my arm and was slowly, in a metal grip, bending it to the point where metal could have been bent. She said, "I've never experienced anything like it in my life." And when I dropped her and let her go, she let go of my arm. She said, I said, "I was in such pain. I have never met a physically stronger person in my entire life, man or woman, than your mother. I can't tell you what her grip is like."
Were you ever spanked as a kid?
My mother only spanked me once. I tell the story in the book. Maybe I could even read it.
After that description, that's probably all it took with the strength.
I was about 7 or 8. We were getting on a crowded bus on Pico Boulevard to go to Boyle Heights, where we had lived till very recently, to visit a friend of hers. And it was a very crowded bus, and there were a lot of people there. And I got on the bus, and the bus driver closed the door, not noticing my little mother. And my mother went running after the bus, screaming. And I'm pounding on the door, "Mom, Mom," I'm like 7 or 8. And my mother kind of caught the bus. The bus driver realized what was going on, stopped the bus, let me off it. And my mother spanked me for the only time in my life. I couldn't understand why she was spanking me. Why was she spanking me? It was Mr. Bus Driver's fault. Not me. Right. Why are you hitting me? And then after she did that, she did something she didn't do again, or hadn't done to my knowledge before, and didn't do again until after she'd had her stroke. And that was, she hugged me. My mother never touched me. She could never hug anybody. And so I write in the book that at the time, when I was being spanked, I realized my mother was probably upset because she thought I would be, even at 7 or 8, I realized she thought I'd be driven away and she might not find me again.
Memories of what she went through, the bus.
Yeah. And then I said, "Look, that I understood. But what I didn't know at the time was that it had happened to her before. My brother, when he was 7 or 8, was taken from her, put on a truck and taken away, never to be seen again. And I didn't know that. And she never, and the trouble was I looked a lot like my brother, who was hard for me to say my older brother. He was clearly older than I was, but he died so young. It's hard for me to think of him as an older brother. But I apparently looked quite a bit like my mother, my brother rather. And my mother confessed to me when she was very old in her last years, that she had found it difficult to look at me when I was a child, because it was difficult for her to look, because I looked like my brother, and the memory was too strong, which is why she, my mother never hugged me or kissed me. I'm not complaining about that. She did finally near the end. She softened up quite a bit about that when she was in her last few years. But yeah, my mother, that was the one time my mother spanked me, and the one time my mother hugged me until she was very old.
How about your father? Describe your father for us.
My father was a wonderful guy. I mean that not just because he was my father. He understood. He had gone through terrible tragedy in his life. My grandfather, his father, had starved to death, quite literally had starved to death during World War I when my father was a little kid. And he had managed to make it out of the country before the Nazis took over, bringing his elderly mother with him and his young sister, and gotten to America. And so he had suffered a lot in his life and had gone through unbelievable things. But compared to my mother, he was by far the less damaged. And he loved my mother, but he understood the handful that she was. And he knew that my father and mother at their wedding, actually. He was the buffer between the two of us. My mother, who was, deeply scarred by the war, I needed my father. And then my father passed away when I was 11 of a heart attack, as was the tradition of men in those days. They all died young from heart attacks. Certainly the tradition of my father's side of the family. I'm a freak. I mean, my father's younger brother, who came to America afterwards, he was able to stay in Europe and then still get out afterwards. He died at 54 of a heart attack. My father at 53. My father's my first cousin, my father's brother's son, died at 56. It runs in the family. That I'm still here is remarkable. But he was a very good guy who'd been very well educated in Europe, but came to America, and like so many well educated at the time, had to take employment, let's say, below his educational level. He drove a truck for the rest of his life, and understood the value of keeping bread on the table. But he was a very wise man. He was a very educated man. He read and spoke 7 or 8 different languages, including Latin, because he'd studied medicine when he was in Romania. But he was a very good guy. But I lost him as the buffer when I was very young.
Yeah. Did any of this that you're describing here sort of precipitate your desire to go into law?
I don't know.
Justice in society, maybe, or
you've hit on something. I know I didn't realize it, but when I was doing research on my book, I read one book, which is a psychological study of second generation by a very fine scholar who herself was a second generation, a psychiatrist. And in the book, she said that in the surveys that had been done, because she'd done a ton of research on this, but also had researched everybody else's research, she discovered that a disproportionately large number of the children of Holocaust survivors had gone into social justice programs. And I had not.
you're his mic just muted. Just happens to happen that way sometimes. It's just a little switch. Fascinating story, isn't it, everybody? I know you guys are commenting. Unbelievable. Wow. We've been reading your comments along the way.
Is it working now?
Yeah. Welcome back.
Yeah, that took about 3 switches to get that back on.
But you did it. You're resilient. Like your mother and father, you're resilient.
I had to put the computer in a place where it's not plugged in, so I hope I'm not running out of juice here. So,
Going into social justice, the
oh yeah,
survivors.
So my theory on being a public defender, and the reason why I had no problem defending guilty people, it's interesting. I remember being hired in a very large class. LA County Public Defender's Office is very big, and there were like 35 of us who were all hired within a month of each other to fill the positions they had available. And I think within 6 months to a year, the vast majority of those were gone because they would go, hey, I didn't sign up for this. All these people are terrible criminals. They're guilty.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you think you were doing?
Yeah.
It's the public defender's office. But my theory was that it is the idiosyncrasy of our criminal justice system that the rights of all of us, of, you know, the archbishops and the doctors and the school teachers are all decided by cases involving the worst amongst us. So, I mean, if you don't give the liberties, civil liberties, and the right of a fair trial to a terrible person, nothing stops you from picking and choosing who you're going to give a fair trial to. And I just felt that it was extremely important. I wasn't necessarily doing this for my clients always. Sometimes I hated my clients, but I was doing it. You know, it's the line from Man for All Seasons, which may sound sort of sappy, but there's this moment in which St. Thomas More, eventually St. Thomas More, is berated by his son-in-law because he, as a magistrate, freed a criminal. And he said, how dare you free that guy? He was obviously guilty. He said, but there was no evidence to convict him on. He said, what difference does it make? You knew he was guilty. And he said, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to not follow the law just because I think somebody's guilty? He said, yes. He said, yeah. So that's your cure to things. I mean, you know, you destroy the law to get the devil. He said, I would tear down every law to get to the devil if I could. And he said, and when all the laws are downed and the devil turned around on you, then behind what would you hide? I give the devil due of law, not for my own, not for the devil's sake, but for mine own. Because if he is not protected by law, I am not safe from its misuse. And you know, that's the way I always felt about it. I mean, I wasn't crazy at all about many of my clients, but if I didn't give them justice, and if the courts didn't give them justice, who knows if I could get it, or if anybody I loved could get it.
There was something you wanted to share personally from the book with our audience.
You know, I was
right?
just thinking that I'll give you a glimpse of what led me to write the book. Was it's hard to explain. My mother's life, I never really planned on writing a book about it. I was gathering the information for myself, and then I happened to stumble across something. It was, it's hard to explain, but it was a pamphlet that was shown to me, and it was just a handful of pages long. It was written by a fellow describing his treacherous trip into Germany to negotiate with a high Nazi official for the release of some Jews. And it sounded like the release was seemingly identical to the way my mother survived near the end of the war. It wasn't the very end of the war, but near the end of the war, not Auschwitz, but another camp that she was in called Ravensbruck, which was another nightmare that, you know, I can't even begin to describe what Ravensbruck was like, except perhaps to say that one of the women who was with my mother in Auschwitz and in Ravensbruck and was also rescued, which it really was what it was a rescue. She said in this testimonial she wrote that I found in the archive, she said, I was in Auschwitz and I was in Ravensbruck. And the Ravensbruck was worse. Can you imagine? Imagine what you're talking about, even to make a comparison. No less to say it was worse.
Right.
So she was rescued, literally rescued from Ravensbruck, not by American soldiers, but literally a rescue. And I never knew how. And here's a description of something that sounded like the Ravensbrook Rescue, written by this guy describing something he was involved in. So I started to research, and that's what took so many years. Looking at old memoirs written by Nazis, by Jews, there was so little historical, there was an occasional reference to this, but it would be like a paragraph in something I would find. And that's why it took me so long to write it. And so the middle of the book is about, and also part of the end, is about how my mother was rescued. And I just had to write it because who else would do it? And it's true. I mean, if people think I've faked this, believe me, I would not fake anything in the book, because I was told by a friend of mine who was a very successful screenwriter who read an early draft. He said, don't write it as a nonfiction. Write this as a novel. You can condense time and you can combine personalities. I said, no, that's the last thing I want to do. I'm afraid people will deny the Holocaust ever occurred when the survivors are dead. I want to write this book as a 100% true history of the events. And yet it's got more drama in it, I think, than most fictions, because, I write in the book that I have a sentence in the book in which I'm describing it, and I say something that's, I know, been said in other words by people. This is how I phrased it. I said, for fiction to be believed, it must possess at least a modicum of plausibility. But truth is not so circumscribed, because much of how my mother survived is like completely unbelievable. If you read it in a novel, you go, well, that's silly. So I had to make certain that everything in the book was true, so that it would be understood that these things really happened. So I did research on it. And this man who wrote the little memorandum, which documented his doing something which resulted in saving my mother's life, who was he? It begins this way. There was this very wealthy industrialist Jewish guy sitting in Lithuania. And one day, being a brilliant guy, he realizes this is really bad news. We got to get out of here. So he takes his wife and his 3 small children, and he manages to get into Sweden. Sweden took very few Jews. A couple of thousand. I think 60,000 Jews tried to get into Sweden before the war, and I think 2,000 were allowed, and he was one of them. He had connections. He gets in, but he gives up his business practice. He's very wealthy, to try to save other Jews. And one day, of all things, he's at a Sunday tea party being thrown by a well-known, Swedish Lutheran. It's not a Jewish party. He's the only Jew there. And he gets introduced to, of all people, an attaché to the head of the Gestapo, who's assigned as an emissary to neutral Sweden. And instead of punching him in the face, he sits down with him. He says, you're a boss. This war is not going to last forever. I have connections. I can get people passports to South America under assumed names. It's possible you and your boss might want to talk to me about this. So he goes, talks to his boss in person, flies back from Berlin into Stockholm, meets with this Jewish industrialist and said, my superior is prepared to have coffee with you. Exact quote. But you must fly to Berlin to meet with him, and in secret. He agrees. He goes to the airport. The plane is on the tarmac. A couple of other guys from the Jewish community have come to see him off on this daredevil trip. But his wife, beautiful young woman, known for her beauty, she was a concert pianist. She'd married this wealthy industrialist who was about a dozen years older than she was. She was the mother of 3 very small children. They'd managed to get out. As far as they knew, and it was actually true, unfortunately, their entire extended family were killed in Lithuania. And she couldn't stand the idea of losing her husband, the father of her children. At the airport, she told him that if he got on this suicidal mission, a Jew to fly into Berlin at the height of the war, she would kill herself. Mm. And at the airport, she described exactly how she'd do it. And now he believed her. And he literally turned to the couple of Jewish businessmen who'd come to see him off, looked at one guy named Norbert Masser and said, "Mr. Masser, you were born in Germany. You were about 18 or 19 when in 1920 you came to Sweden. You speak German fluently. I can't go. My wife will kill herself. You're the only one who can do this." And instead of saying, "What, are you crazy? There's a plane out there. It's going to take me into Berlin. I'm a Jew. I got a wife too. She's sitting at home. What is she going to think if I just get on this plane?" Instead, he goes, "Okay." Gets on the plane. And I can read you, hopefully, a small portion of it.
That would be great.
At 2 p.m., April 19th, 1945, flying from Stockholm to Copenhagen aboard a Swedish plane and then transferring to a small German aircraft bearing a large swastika, Masser left Sweden with ravaged Berlin as his destination. This was his first assignment outside the safe confines of Sweden. He would not only have to perform it in a nation where being a Jew was a capital offense, but he was traveling there to meet the head executioner. As they approached Tempelhof Airport, just before 6 p.m., he could hear the sound of sporadic explosions and could see the city now dominated by ruins rather than buildings. The German capital looked to him, quote, as if it were dead. He carried neither visa nor any legal papers justifying his presence in Germany. His visit was a guarded secret even from the Nazi leadership, who were preparing to gather to celebrate their Fuhrer's 20th birthday. April 20th birthday. Soon after landing, he was greeted by a half a dozen well-groomed, uniformed German officers who crisply saluted, "Heil Hitler," out of either discretion or a recognition of the surreal irony of the moment. The Jewish gentleman, who, by the way, was a furrier, that was his full-time job. He sold furs. The furrier removed his hat and politely responded, "Good evening." Their car was late. As he sat in the waiting room, the rabidly anti-Semitic orator Goebbels could be heard broadcasting over the airport's loudspeaker. In celebration of his dictator's birthday, Goebbels was extolling the virtues and accomplishments of his Führer, whom he described as defiant and combative. Seemingly unfazed, the only Jew in the Berlin airport prepared for his appointment. After a couple of hours of delay, a Gestapo car arrived, picked him up for the 70-kilometer drive north. Large sections of Germany remained unscarred by the conflict, but not the areas Masser was traveling through now. For an hour and a half, he passed ghost-like ruins of bombed-out buildings, taking detours to avoid streets filled with debris and closures caused by recent Allied bombing raids of Berlin. They reached the highway as the nightly bombings began. As he turned to look out at the capital, the flashes of bombs exploding appeared to lay unbroken before him. He feared that at any moment their moving vehicle would similarly be targeted for destruction. Driving in darkness and with their lights off so as now not to attempt attack, they heard the whirling of airplanes coming from all directions, but there was no sound of German artillery response. By the way, they arrived just before midnight. As Masser arrived at the intended destination, he was greeted by an astrologer. This was Wilhelm Wolff, who informed the new visitor that morning the Allied bombing raids of Berlin had been so heavy that they had severely damaged the area's power stations, plummeting the house into darkness without radio or phone. Wolff's high-ranking employer, that was the astrologer, his high-ranking employer, was not there and would not be arriving anytime soon. In fact, as night became day and day again turned into night, all of those present began to worry that he might never appear. Could he have changed his mind about the risky meeting? Had Hitler given him a new assignment? They were in an active war zone, and Masser's own drive from the airport had been fraught with peril. He now feared that on his way to discuss the freeing of Jewish captives, the hated Nazi might have fallen victim to what would prove to be the last night of Allied bombing raids against Berlin. As he waited, he was in the unimaginable position of being the only Jew in the world, hoping that the Gestapo leader was safe and near. At 2:30 in the morning, the anxious visitor from Sweden heard something moving over the gravel road, and then the sound of car doors slamming. Heinrich Himmler had arrived for coffee. So
Wow.
it was that.
Yeah.
It was that he spends the night negotiating with Heinrich Himmler. Now, this is like, I mean, you could analogize it to like one of those James Bond movies where Bond is sitting around a table with all the villains, including the head of Smersh or Spectre or whatever the name is. The difference is that's a movie.
This is real.
There's a little Jewish businessman
Yeah.
sitting at a table with a bunch of Nazis, including Heinrich Himmler, second in command of the German government and the architect of the Holocaust. And Himmler, and people wonder why. I was asked this by a librarian once, a head librarian from it. Why in the world would Himmler want to talk to him? Himmler was a Nazi. And the thing you don't understand about these people is they're dedicated to a mythology, which you can see in QAnon today. Almost every single QAnon conspiracy theory is taken from anti-Semitic tropes, the blood libel. All of these are anti-Semitic tropes, and Himmler couldn't talk to Churchill openly or to Eisenhower, but he wanted to set, believe it or not, a separate ceasefire on the Western Front to save himself and maybe Germany from its destruction in the following weeks and months that could have been the war. And if you can't talk to the guys who run the government, no problem. Talk to a Jew. Jews, they're all together. They're all part of some, conspiracy. They run the world. You can't talk to the puppets. Talk to the puppet master. So he literally says to Masser, I'm interested in potentially getting word to the Allied commanders. I'd be interested in discussing a ceasefire on the Western Front. Do you think you can deliver this information for me? And instead of saying, I'm a furrier, you want to talk to a prime minister, talk to Eisenhower. What are you doing talking to me? Instead, he goes, yeah, sure, no problem. But first, you got to do a little something for me. I was driving up here from Berlin for this meeting. And halfway between Berlin and here, I passed a place called Ravensbruck. I know what's going on in that place. You're killing Jewish women. Ravensbruck was a completely Jewish not completely Jewish, but a women's prison. Only women were there. At the very end of the war, there were some men housed there as well, but at the very end, it had been it was the world's largest women's prison, if you want to think of it that way. 20% of the population being Jews. The women who were not Jews didn't tend to be killed, but the women who were Jews were being killed. There was a gas chamber there. It was built later in the war. After Auschwitz shuttered its gas chamber because the Russians were arriving, they built a makeshift gas chamber in Ravensbruck, and they continued the killings there. Masser knew this. Word had leaked out. I was passing it. I know there are Jewish women in there being killed. I want you to order the release of some of them as a gesture of good faith, and then I'll do what you want. And Himmler says, yeah, okay, no problem. I'll take care of that. You go back to Sweden. I'll take care of it at some point. He said, no. The guts on this guy. The nerve. He says, no. To the head of the Gestapo. To the head of the SS. I want you to order it now. I want you to order the release right now as a gesture of good faith. I assure you, it will look very good for you to have done this. I'll be able to do this job much more easily if you're willing to release some women. And Himmler says, okay, or some women released from Ravensbrook. He gives the order. My mother is sitting in Ravensbrook. And all of a sudden, one of the guards comes over and says, anybody here? Polish Jews, Polish Jewish women? You want to get on a bus and go to Sweden? And the women don't want to go. They're terrified. They don't even identify themselves as Jews. Maybe they've forgotten we're Jews. They're afraid to get on the bus. Some of them wrote, we were afraid to get on because we thought maybe it was a gas chamber in disguise. You had to be lucky. You had to be strong. You had to be smart enough to take advantage of the luck. My mother went. It was a harrowing drive. Women were killed. The Allies bombed the buses, thinking they were German. I'm alive today. All thanks to this little Jewish businessman.
Unbelievable.
Sit with the head of the SS and negotiate a release of some Jewish women of Ravensbruck.
It was interesting. My aunt Dorith, who grew up in Vienna, Austria, still to this day tells me these wonderful, well, not wonderful, I would say incredible and amazing stories about how when they were growing up during the war in Austria, how when the Germans and the Russians would come, they would hide in the basements or in closets whenever they would hear the marching and the pounding on the door, because they were coming for the women and the children at that time. And to this day, living up in Massachusetts as she does, she's still with her Viennese accent tells the story about it all and what it was really, really like. Really fascinating. I have to tell you, just showing you some of the comments coming in here. Maureen in Arizona says, my uncle listens to books on tape. He would love this one. Any chance you might do that? Audio books?
I actually, there is one. You know, they sold, the publisher sold the book rights to recorded books. Books. They didn't tell me. Then they called me. They wrote me a letter and said, "Oh yeah, we just sold the rights to recorded books." I said, "Well, I'd like to do it myself. I can read."
You could.
And I think I will know where the emphasis are. And they went, "You have to talk to them." So I called them up and they said, "Well, we actually are arranging for this actor to do it." And I said, "If his name is Liev Schreiber, I'll let him do it.
Yeah, but
otherwise, I prefer doing it myself." Well, his name wasn't Liev Schreiber, but they wanted me to audition. So I actually read a portion of the book. I was in a hotel room at the time. I read it into my phone and then sent it to them. And they said, "Oh, okay, yeah, you can do it."
You could do it. Auditioning for your own story.
And if you want to, if you want to hear something about that, the nightmares, I talk about my mother riding on a train with my brother. They were visiting her sister who lived in Belgium. And my mother brought my brother a red ball. And she bought it to him for a particular reason. He sat there, this little boy, 3 or 4 years old, and she said, "Now there are going to be some uniformed men coming on pretty soon," because they had to travel through Germany to get there. "And when the men arrive, I want you to only look at your new ball. Do not look up at the men." Because even then she was afraid, of course. So I wrote this about the book, you talk about I said, "Night terrors involving the shades of their former oppressors are common amongst survivors. And 60 years after she boarded that train to Berlin, my mother would often wake from nightmares, calling to her caregiver, disoriented, with glazed eyes, in a breathless attempt to focus her gaze around the bedroom. She would ask, a bit sheepishly, yet unsettlingly, der Gestapo?" Then, regardless of the time of day or night, she would call me. She was, I add, she was not calling because she was afraid for herself. Rather, she was checking to make certain that I was safe. Because there was no reason for the unimaginable horrors that had taken her children, she could never be convinced that they could not happen again.
Really is absolutely riveting, Stan. I just want to show you some of these comments coming in. Maureen still can't believe you had to audition to read your own book.
Yeah, yeah. It's a business, I understand.
It's all the business. Kathleen Walker in New York City says the book sounds amazing, and so is this conversation. Cynthia Catherine Howard in Washington, D.C. says, I will be ordering Mr. Goldman's book tonight. Juanita,
it's easiest to find it just under Stan Goldman.
Stan Goldman.
There are two books under Stan Goldman. One's about Herman Melville. The other's about the Holocaust. Get the one about the Holocaust.
Mary
But
Bishop
we'll talk
and
about that later.
Mary Bishop in Florida says, I need to get this book. And Juanita in South Africa says, wow, wonderfully written. Any plans to make the book into a movie?
Yeah, it's not my business to make movies. If somebody ever, I remember I was in negotiations with Penguin, which was going to buy the book, and at the last minute, the negotiations fell through. But I remember the acquisitional editor at Penguin said, it's a tough shelf, which was a publisher's way of saying, you gotta be just right on a Holocaust book. Some sell really big, but some are difficult subject. I assure you, although there's hard things in my book, it is a book intended to be uplifting. And it really is a story of survival and the courage of these women and the fortitude of these women. And also this, that one person can make such a difference. This little Jewish businessman flying in at the risk of his life into Berlin to meet with the head of the SS is the reason why I'm alive today.
Mm-hmm. It's incredible. Cynthia,
one person can do it sometimes.
Also adds there in Washington, she goes, this is as fascinating as Oskar Schindler's biography.
Schindler's name actually comes up at one point in the book because there are minor connections because of the attempts to save Jews to a number of different things that took place in Europe. One of which was the reason why Himmler thought that perhaps he could save himself, which is an interesting story, which, by the way, actually quite unintentionally ended up involving some very famous names of people from the Holocaust, and Frank included, oddly enough, who makes an appearance in my book in a very unexpected way.
Was writing this book therapeutic and or cathartic for you, and did it bring you closer to the people, including your mother, contained within the book?
I think catharsis is an interesting term. I would have to say no if we use that term in terms of getting the ghosts out, but yes in terms of an understanding of myself as well as my mother, and an understanding of, I only created the Center for the Study of Law and Genocide, which I managed to do thanks to the kind contributions of a lot of very wealthy former students of mine who I hit up for money to start it. I only created that after I started working on the book, because it gave me more of an immediate realization as to the origins of genocide, and the fact that we, unfortunately, as human beings, our DNA is built in such a way that we learn to very quickly hate others and to fear them, because we're afraid if they came into our cave or into our village, they might take what we had. And therefore, if you were someone who feared and was able to use violence against others, you had more of a chance of surviving to pass your DNA on to future generations. And so that genocide has been with us for millennium and continues to be with us. But the good news, so you're not too pessimistic about it, there's a very small, unfortunate psychological gap that exists between deciding somebody is an other and fearing them to feeling the need to kill them. It turns out to be a very short psychological gap, but turns out it doesn't take a lot to convince people that somebody is not an other, but one of them. And as soon as they recognize them as being like them, as opposed to not being like them, the urge to dismiss them, to destroy them, to kill them is gone. It disappears. Mm-hmm. So there is reason to be pessimistic, but also reason to be optimistic for our human race.
What do you hope people are left with when they read this book?
I hope there's a few lessons out of it. I think they begin to understand how hatred and these conspiracy theories are so dangerous that, you know, in the words of Voltaire, maybe I should have quoted it in my book. Voltaire, who was, by the way, an anti-Semite, so it's odd I'd be quoting him on this, but he actually said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And I think that is very true. And we have to be forever vigilant. I also write the book. There's a lesson in it. You asked about how I feel about my mother. I dedicated a large part of my life to making sure my mother had no pain, no psychological pain. And I think I went too far. I think I did too much. I was fearful that she was this frail creature who would be destroyed if I didn't do everything she needed. And it wasn't true. My mother was one of the strongest people of the 20th century. That even the women who survived Auschwitz with her, it turned out, said that she was the strongest amongst them. You know, when they give up hope, she'd save them by telling them they had to live. They would have, don't let the Nazis win this. We have to survive. She was really, even in that illustrious, remarkable group, she was a little different. And but my fear that she was so fragile, I mean, I let my mother run my life for a long, long time. I was, you know, I wanted younger people to read this book and understand that sometimes you can go too far in doing what your parents want and doing things for them. And there comes a point in your life in which you have to make decisions of your own and not be misled by what you think it's the better thing to do. You have to think about it. And I've had quite a few students of mine who've read the book who are, you know, of Central American ancestry, Chinese ancestry, who've come to see me and said, oh, Professor Goldman, I know you're Jewish and I'm not, but I recognized my relationship with my mother in this book. Had I read this book when I was in high school, I think I would have known far more how to deal with her in these last half dozen years. And I think there's I don't try to make a saint out of anybody in this book. I mean, it is the unvarnished truth. My mother was obsessive about my safety and incredibly controlling, as you can understand. But understanding it and going along with it in a kind of codependency relationship is not good either.
Beautifully said. I think very inspiring too. And I know from the comments I've been seeing throughout our conversation, Stan, a lot of people moved by your openness, your expressiveness, your passionate and enthusiastic way of telling these stories. And I think it's something that isn't just a book you read once. I think it's one of those books that you're going to keep picking up again and again. You're going to leave it on the coffee table and you're going to reference it and might even find, maybe not as dramatically, but elements in one's own life that can be identified with some elements of the way the story is written and the book is written and the story is told, because we can all find connection. Like you say, we're all unified. We're all really one. And I think that it really is fascinating that you're fascinating. I mean, all the amazing things you've done in your life and continue to do, buck the odds, just really, you've got the fortitude and resilience of these family members that you talk about in the way that you do. It's obviously been passed down. It's obviously there. And you've touched the law in so many different ways as a professor, as a correspondent, you know, as somebody who has now written this extraordinary book. I just, hats off to you for doing all of this. I can only imagine, as tough as you might be as a professor, you know, you do it in love, you do it because you really want them to get something out of it. Just like with the book, just like with you coming on our show tonight, you really want to touch people and leave an impact. Because these people that you talk about, you know, went through these horrific scenarios, but some like your mother, came out resilient, changed forever, but resilient, as is Stan Goldman resilient.
I'm not a patch on my mother. I'm not. I wouldn't even attempt it. Although the one thing is, my mother had dark hair well into her life, so that's the only thing that shows that that's the that I've got going for me. But other than that, I'd be lucky to have had a fraction of her strength and her skill.
Kathy Short in Cleveland says, I'd love to read this book. It sounds fascinating. And Cynthia in Washington says, under the Nazis, the Jews fought, bled, and died, yet they always kept their ancient culture and faith intact. I pray that dark part of history will never be repeated again. And Juanita, even though it's getting dark in the room there, is fascinated by those portraits behind you.
Oh, they're Chagall's Bible series. Original, but very inexpensive. Chagall did some prints in large volume. These were like at 6,000 at a time. So they're original, but they're from his series of the Old Testament, the Bible.
Really a fascinating conversation. Absolutely, Stan. And I really hope the show met whatever expectations you had, and that you enjoyed the time with me as much as I absolutely positively have with you.
That's all right. No matter what you say, I'll still have Jewish guilt for talking so much. I'll go to bed tonight and go, I went on and on and on. I shouldn't have.
Not at all. I'm from New York. Have you ever met a New Yorker that can't talk?
Everybody thinks I'm a New Yorker.
Yes, I would have said East Coast.
But this is Jewish in my voice that people assume is New York.
I would say you would have like Bensonhurst or something, Yeah. I bet you his battery ran out. Now, how funny is that? As he's talking about how long he talked, did somebody upstairs pull the plug on him because he was talking so long? Did his Jewish guilt come into play and unplug him? He's sort of there, but not really. I think, well, at least we got the thank yous in there, right? I have to say that was incredibly riveting. Maybe he'll try to get back on, but at least we got our thank yous. And I just want to show you the cover of the book as well. And again, you can find the book online, Amazon, all the usual places. The name of the book that we've been talking about is Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream: The Bargain That Broke Adolf Hitler and Saved My Mother. Incredible. He was so open about the experience. And there is his mother and father there, he said, on the wedding day as well. And some other shots there. And I think he's coming back. Here he goes. He's got the...
You're right. The battery ran so low, I couldn't get it to connect.
I said, just as he's talking about the Jewish guilt for talking so long, I wonder if somebody above might have pulled the plug.
It's there's somebody else up there watching, I think, telling me to shut up. Stanley. There's one. I say in the book at one point when my mother wanted me to write the book. And I said, oh, yeah, she would have, because people kept asking me that. So I wrote saying, what would my mother have thought? I think she would have been pleased that I wrote about it and thought about her, but then she would have stopped and said, but Stanley, I think you should stop now before you get too tired or upset.
And are you hungry?
Yeah.
Now, actually, with the light, you can see those prints behind you. Beautiful.
Yeah. I used to be. I had a job when I was young. I worked in a framing store. I was the guy who did the designing for the frame. So I picked the matting and the framings for pictures. So I did all these myself.
Beautiful job.
Different life. Well, you need a few bucks when you're young.
Absolutely. Mona in Louisiana says, thank you so much for your time and sharing your story with us. Truly interesting. So nice to meet you, Stan. Take care.
Pleasure. Sorry we had that. Oh,
that was fine.
Snafu.
Hey, you and I are pros, broadcasters. We know how to just vamp when we have to.
That's right. That's
knowing
right.
you'll come back.
A little soft shoe. Yeah.
Yeah, a little soft show. Keep everybody, intrigued. Mona says, I will also order the book. And Wozniak in Jacksonville, Florida area says, thank you, Stan, for sharing your mother's experiences with us. I'm going to order your book and read it. Karen Campbell Green in Nova Scotia. It was such an intriguing evening with you, Stanley. Cynthia, Catherine Howard in Washington, D.C. says, Mr. Goldman, I have enjoyed every minute of your fascinating book and stories. Thank you. May God bless you and your family. Juanita in South Africa, where it's already tomorrow. She's a real trooper. Wow, this has been the most fascinating episode ever. Thank you, Stan, for sharing your very interesting stories with us. Kathy Short in Cleveland. Wonderful show tonight. Thank you so much. Maureen in Arizona. This has been a conversation I will not soon forget. Thank you so much, Stan, for your extraordinary story with us. Kathleen Walker in New York City. This has been fascinating. Thank you for sharing your life with us, Stan, as well. And when your battery died out, they were wondering if George Burns might have pulled the plug on you, because here he is. And he says, good night, Gracie.
Yeah, good night, Gracie. Yeah. A favorite of mine growing up as a kid. I used to love watching him do monologues
with a cigar and everything. This was epic, my friend. I hope we get a chance, either if you're on the East Coast or I'm doing a TV shoot on the West Coast, to maybe meet and break bread. I would love to do that. It would be a pleasure. Hope the show met whatever expectation you had of
it was wonderful. It's rare I have anybody who understands the book as well as you did and poses the questions. Also, all that business about law, you certainly didn't know what to ask. Yeah, I'm very grateful. Thank you. And once again, I didn't write the book to make any money out of it. I didn't write the book to get famous. I was on TV 4,000 or 5,000 times in my life. It's never gotten me a better seat in a restaurant. I wrote the book just to do what we're doing now, to tell people what happened and ways to deal with things so that they either, with respect to what's happened in the past or what to stop things happening in the future. I can't stop being a teacher. I've been doing it for too long.
Right. And to never forget and to realize that we learn there's always teachable moments, and anything that's going on in today's world, to remember some of these very important stories. Absolutely. Karen in Nova Scotia says, yes, it was an epic, great episode. Again, the book, let's show that cover again. Again, available at Amazon, all the usual places, your website as well.
Yes, or at Potomac Books, you can get it online there. You get it. There are probably some local bookstores that might have it. I always like to promote local bookstores because they're having issues, obviously.
Yeah.
But yes, the easiest way, I hate to say it, is of course to just look up Stan Goldman on Amazon and order it that way, unless you want to get it from a local book dealer.
Looks like a lot of people are doing that tonight from what they're saying. And Karen says this has also been very educational. I toast you, Stan. Thanks for all of the time.
Thank you.
It was really 2 hours, 20 minutes. It felt like a half hour, and a New York minute went by. And thanks for being so open, and thanks for being so generous with your time. And you're welcome back anytime. We'll keep the porch light on for you.
Oh, thank you. I'm sincere about this. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to tell the story and bring it to people. I appreciate that. Thank you.
The pleasure is all mine. We'll see you again soon. You stay safe and be well, Stan, okay?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye now. Yes. That's a good question. Yeah. They said if they order it from your website, do you autograph it if it's ordered from your website?
Well, I don't know if they can get it from my website. My website just links to places where you can get it. I'd be happy to sign a copy for people if they're in Los Angeles. It's easy. If I literally had somebody send me a copy and ask me to autograph it and send it back to them in an envelope, and I did. Sure. I'm, when things reopen up again, I was just starting to do talks in front of groups,
meets and greets,
book clubs, synagogue churches about the book when everything went dark. So I hope to be doing that again, maybe next year or so.
Absolutely. And Karen must have come in late, but is it an audiobook that's available as well? Absolutely. Thanks again, Stan. It was a real pleasure and an honor. You take care.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Again, a very special guest, Professor Stanley A. Goldman, tenured professor of law at Loyola Law, and that's in Los Angeles, and also a veteran television broadcaster, on-air correspondent. You probably saw him on CBS and CNBC and Fox and lots of different networks, national networks in the United States. Also, he's called upon often by the affiliated stations in the greater Los Angeles area, the CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox affiliates, for his commentary and expertise. He's a tenured professor of law, again at Loyola Law in LA, and a renowned expert on legal matters, and covered all the major trials, and a lawyer himself, and really an amazing conversation, right? Something different, as I say, on the Jim Masters Show live entertainment lifestyle talk show series. We have everything. We don't just have singing and dancing. We don't just have comedy. We don't just have food. It's life. This is life. And I think it's quite exciting. It's quite exciting as your host for me to be able to share these topics and these conversations with all of you, and for you guys to participate in it as well. I know you found this riveting. Many of you I could see you just like listening, and I could almost pretend that I could see you guys on your chair. Really absolutely amazing. Thank you, Karen. Something we can all learn from, right? That we need to be unified, and we need to understand the plight of individuals, and understand, their take on things, and that we all have something to give. We mentioned that a lot on this show, right? We all have something to give, regardless of our religion or political views or eye color or gender or zip code or income. We all have a story, all of us, all of our nationalities, all of our cultures, all of our backgrounds. We're all here for a reason. And this was really riveting and very fascinating. Cynthia says, Jim, this has been one of your best shows ever, and you asked the best questions. I know I had my professional television and radio hat on for this episode. We certainly appreciate great guests like Stan Goldman. We're going to sprinkle in a lot of different things in this entertainment lifestyle talk show series. We have a lot of fun. We have a lot of levity and levity. Of course, we'll never lose that. That's the crux of our show. But we also have time and give time to really inspiring topics, conversations, guests, and interaction between myself, the host and producer, and all of you watching around the world, as well as with our amazing guests. So thank you, Cynthia, Catherine Howard in Washington, D.C. Again, I'm sure you've seen him on television and maybe read his materials in the New York Daily News over the years. His book, again, I'll show you the cover of the book so you can see it in case you want to order it. Left to the mercy of a rude stream, the bargain that broke Adolf Hitler and saved my mother. Stanley A. Goldman is the author. There is his mother and father. There is his mom on the right there in later years. There he is with his mother as well. Another shot. And he talked about this shot as well. Really fascinating. Again, we thank very much Stanley A. Goldman, Stan, for joining us here as my special guest tonight on the Jim Masters Show Live. If you'd like to see this episode again or share it through our YouTube channel, by all means, go ahead. We would love that. And if you're joining us for the first time live or in the archives, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love that. He has led a very interesting life and career, I agree, and still does. Professor of law, tenured professor of law at Loyola as well. This show was terrific. Stan was so informative. Kathy Short in Cleveland, thank you very much. Glad you guys enjoyed this. Again, we had lots of levity this afternoon. If you didn't see, we did a pop-up show at about 12:45 p.m. Popped up surprise show. We did about 2 hours of great conversation with all of you, nice and casual. We had an awesome time. It was epic. And thanks to those of you who joined us. We just surprised everybody and popped up on YouTube and Facebook, and we're going to be doing more of that. We've done a lot of pop-up shows since this series started, and I know you guys love that. So we'll be doing more of those Jim Masters Show Live pop-up shows. We had a coffee chat with all of you in the afternoon, and it was really, really very cool. And then tonight we had this epic show with Stan Goldman, which I'm so glad you guys stuck around for and joined us for. And those who are going to be watching this later in the archives, this episode is available at YouTube at Jim Masters TV. Subscribe to the channel if you can, and tell everybody about our show and the channel. We would really love that. It really helps the show grow and more new people. You see a lot of new faces, people hearing about the show, because there's so much of a blur of content and material out there these days, all over the place. Some of it good, some of it terrific. Hopefully you feel our broadcast here is terrific. And we work very hard behind the scenes to make it so, whether we're having a fun night or we've got entertainment, or we are just talking about some deep topics like tonight. Goodness, Jim, this was amazing. Picking my jaw up from the ground now. You did an exceptional job of navigating the conversation. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Giving you maybe a little glimpse of some of the work I do professionally, have done over the years professionally as a television, radio host, presenter, and personality and journalist. So I had that hat on tonight, although I have it on when we have fun too. But this was a little bit of a extra inspiring episode. It's a good thing your short pop-up show went long so I could catch it after my meeting. I texted you this afternoon. Cool. I will check that out. Thank you, Kathleen. I saw you on there. Very nice to see you, Jim. That shirt looks good on you as always. Thank you very much, Mona. And Cynthia says, sorry, I missed you all earlier today. Walter, my Yorkie, and I went hiking. Check it out. It's on our YouTube channel, that episode. You can see it, binge watch over the weekend. A lot of people binge watch our episodes over the weekend. They just, because the episodes on YouTube roll one after the other. So if you ever miss anything, don't worry. Everything is there on our YouTube channel for you. And I love it. Love all of you as well. Ann Wozniak says, this show is very informative and fascinating. Thank you, Jim, for another amazing evening. Good night, everyone. Tomorrow is going to be awesome. Also, see everyone then. Yes, let's quickly tell you about tomorrow. Really epic. We're going to be back early tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And that is 7 p.m. in Ireland, Scotland, England. Celtic Thunders. Neil Byrne, my buddy Neil Byrne, makes a return visit to the Jim Masters Show live for some great Irish crack, terrific conversation, laughs, and poignant moments and music. He's going to perform live as well. That is tomorrow, Saturday, special time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, live. Again, if you missed the show, you can see it in the archives at Jim Masters TV on YouTube. However, if you want to participate in the show, we will be live at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And for folks in the UK and Ireland and other parts of Europe, 7 p.m. I believe. Juanita said it'll be 8 p.m. for her, where she is in South Africa. I think it's going to be around that time, maybe in Greece and other parts as well. It'll already be tomorrow for folks watching in Australia. And then tomorrow night, George Chakiris from West Side Story. There he is. You remember him as one of the stars of West Side Story, right? With Rita Moreno, as well as White Christmas, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and There's No Business Like Show Business. He was in them all. Academy Award-winning dancer and actor George Chakiris is with us live tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. That's 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And then on Sunday, another legend we're going to be talking about, Bob Hope, with this incredible epic book, Dear Bob, Bob Hope's wartime correspondence with the GIs of World War II, written and compiled by Martha Bolton and Linda Hope, who is Bob Hope's daughter. This will be this Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, right here on the Jim Masters Show live. That is coming up this Sunday. So we have Neil Byrne at 2 p.m. Eastern from Celtic Thunder and Byrne and Kelly. We have Academy Award-winning dancer and actor George Chakiris tomorrow night. Double Levity tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. It's going to be really, really cool. There he is accepting the Oscar. And then Martha Bolton, and this incredible book, as well as these amazing stories about Bob Hope on Sunday. Hey, if you weren't with us earlier, I'm going to share this again. This was really beautiful from one of our lovely viewers, Amy. We shared this with you with our Friday afternoon coffee host chat pop-up show, which again, if you missed it, we had a lot of laughs. You can see it on our YouTube channel. Just look for where it says the Jim Master Show Live Friday afternoon pop-up show episode. That was today. This was written by Amy in Mississippi, and she sent it to me during the live show, and I wanted to share it with all of you. She wrote this for our show, and I really appreciate this. The world needs more love, more levity to go around. Showing more compassion, more goodness can be found. Jim Masters is the perfect host with a heart made of pure gold, creates a wonderful space where kindness is true and bold, spreading love and levity, creating levity for all. Positive vibes and conversation can be found in Levity Hall. Welcome to all his guests. Positivity is front and center. International audiences of levities make this show a proven winner. Thank you, Amy. We love that. That is so beautiful. And also, yes, Gabriella, I'm sure she's in bed right now, but earlier she was our Queen Levity special guest by way of instant photo sent to me during the live show this afternoon during our pop-up show. We wanted to show it again. That is beautiful, Gabriella. And that Juanita's daughter, who was all excited, they took this picture this afternoon and they sent it to me live during the show. And guess what? We got it on the air, and she had a ball. She was just doing backflips, Juanita said, which was cute. And Patricia Welch sent this from Devon in beautiful United Kingdom. This is one of the views where she is. She sent this earlier this afternoon during our pop-up show, which was terrific. And I had shared these photos with all of you when I was on a television shoot in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and then other areas of the Netherlands as well. We were there twice, actually, for two separate television projects. There, I think I was doing the show open and the intro, welcome to the Netherlands type thing. And this was also when we were in the Netherlands, in the central part of Amsterdam, which was really, really cool. Fantastic. I hope to get back to Europe soon. Really, really wonderful. As is joining all of you. Let's check in with some of these terrific comments. Yes, hearts from Juanita. Of course, that was a lot of fun. Wow, love it. Thanks, Amy. Yes, the exclusive poem for the Jim Master Show Live, which I really appreciate. Mona, and we thank Amy for that. Looking forward to the episode with Neil. To then wishing you all a lovely night. Sleep well. Thank you, Jim, for the amazing, entertaining day. Double levity today, double levity tomorrow. Whew. What show does that? We do. The Jim Master Show Live does. And Cynthia, Catherine Howard says, love to you, Jim, and all the levities. Looking forward to the show tomorrow. Stay safe and sweet dreams, everyone, to you as well. Cynthia in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Mona in beautiful Louisiana. Good night to Jim and all the levities, and hope you all have a great night. Thanks for a great show tonight. Hugs and love to all. You as well, Mona. Gary in Iowa says, good night, Jim and all levities. It was great having you here, Gary. Mary Bishop in Florida. Good night, everyone. Have a peaceful night. Take care. You as well. To Mary, and have a great night, Jim. Levity. Hugs. Look at all those cool emojis. Stay safe. Good night, all. Neil Byrne tomorrow. My buddy is back for a return visit. And Dream of Denver. Yes, Dream of Denver, who sent me the Gilligan doll over there. Gilligan is there, and there's Jeannie, and there's Jimmy, and there's Silver, and we'll probably bring back Linlin this weekend. She's with us. She wrote a new book, Gilligan's Dreams, and we're going to share it Tuesday night. She's with us this Tuesday night. Dream of Denver returns. Of course, wonderful actress, author, and wife of Bob Denver, who played Gilligan on Gilligan's Island. So she'll be here Tuesday. And fun and drama all in a day's work. Thank you, Juanita. I'm smiling and laughing because I like what Gary wrote. It's funny. I saw it scrolling and I just thought it's funny the way he, I've been called a lot of things, but I've never been referred to as this. Jim, you are very bingeable. I like that. I like being bingeable. That's a good thing. That means I'm doing something right, huh? If I'm bingeable. I was saying earlier, you can binge watch all of our episodes of the Jim Master Show live on our YouTube channel. So Gary says, I am very bingeable. Thank you very much. I will take that, which it is, as a spectacular comment. Gary in Iowa. And Karen says, the pop-up show today was exactly what I needed. Thank you very much. I actually heard from a lot of people today, and there was one who commented on the YouTube channel who actually asked me if I could make sure I don't, delete the show. And we're not deleting the show. We wouldn't delete the show that's on, the YouTube channel, our show that we did this afternoon. But it says, hi, Jim, please. This is from Irish 43. You've seen Irish 43, who's been on our show, right? She goes, hi, Jim, please save this as I would love to watch it later. She's talking about the pop-up show we did this afternoon, the Friday afternoon pop-up. She goes, it has been a very long and rough day for me. Thanks very much, and much love to all the lovities out there. That's from Irish 43, who posted that on our YouTube channel underneath the episode of the Jim Masters Show Live, which was the Friday afternoon pop-up show. She says, please save this as I would love to watch it later. It's been a very long and rough day for me. I appreciate that. That means that she's hoping the show will provide some positive vibes for her. So check it out if you missed it. And lovity to you all. The bingeable Mr. Lovity. Doesn't that sound like some sort of a British comedy or something? It sounds very British, doesn't it? The bingeable Mr. Lovity, something that Masterpiece Theater would have thought up. I think I'm going to get a shirt. I have to get a shirt or something that says that. I am the bingeable Mr. Lovity. Good afternoon. I'm James Masters, the bingeable Mr. Lovity. That's cool. I like that. That's a cool tagline. And your daughter is a princess. Absolutely. You are now calling her Princess Lovity. She loves it. Absolutely. Princess Lovity. She sure is. She's a cutie too. Peace, love, and lovity to all, and virtual hugs. Yes, we'll do our evening love as well. Hug. And good night, Jim, and all lovely friends. What I saw was extremely fascinating with Stan, but I'm not well today, so we'll watch later in the archives. Hope to see the shows tomorrow. Hugs. Hope you're feeling better. I know you had your second vaccine shot, so I'm hoping you're feeling better and not under the weather. I know some have said that the second one, and I have mine coming up in a matter of weeks, could be a little bit of a doozy for some. So hopefully you are feeling better real soon. Christine Clifton. And again, everybody can watch these bingeable episodes on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to smile, everybody. We say this at the end of all the shows. Don't forget to share the lovity. Don't forget to find your Zen place. Mine is with loving family and friends, as well as, of course, cycling and tennis and music and writing and the ocean. The ocean, getting out in nature and floating, swimming, boogie boarding, surfing, all of it. Sailing, just looking at the ocean is very peaceful. So get out and follow those constants in life. When the world seems like a little nutty, get out there and go to the ocean. You know what I mean? Go to nature, whatever it is, the ocean, the forest, garden. Plant a garden this year when the weather, if you're not in a time zone, if you're not in a zone, not time zone, but if you're not in a location where the weather is ready yet, some of the garden centers around here already have the early flowers out, like pansies, the ones that can withstand the cold. So it's kind of nice to see the garden centers are gearing up. I think it's going to be another banner gardening year for people. I'm a green thumb gardener, so I look forward to it. Anything that's nurturing, and I've actually been doing that since I was a kid. Family love to do that as well. So find the constants in life, gang, and surround yourself with them. My career in television and radio, stage, on air, on camera, behind the scenes has always been a blessing to me and continues to be a blessing. So I love that as well. And don't forget, you can find the Jim Masters Show live, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, live here as well on YouTube at Jim Masters TV. Sometimes we also do it on Facebook. Earlier, we did the episode on Facebook as well. But tomorrow we've got 2 shows. Okay, so we have 2 shows. We have one at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific with Neil Byrne, and then again 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and that is George Chakiris coming up, the Academy Award-winning dancer and actor. And don't forget, as always, we say to relax, love one another, take care of one another, breathe, love one another, and love yourself. Don't forget to relax. We've got the weekend coming up. If you can relax, go ahead, do it. Relax. Have a good time. Because we love you and you deserve to relax. We all deserve to relax every once in a while, right? So, gang, this was really awesome. This was really an amazing conversation. And we thank you for participating. And lovity, spread that lovity. Absolutely. And you're the best. So we're gonna duck out. Thanks again to Stan Goldman for all of his time and attention. Thanks to all of you for joining us here on the Jim Masters Show Live. We're going to call it a night, and we'll be back early, 2 p.m. Eastern. 11, I was going to say 4. I'm so used to saying 4, 11 a.m. Pacific. Right here on the Jim Masters Show Live. You like the sound effects? Then we will provide more singing. We'll be strutting. I know you want me to strut that soon, and more singing and more levity. All right, gang. Thanks very much for joining us. Really a privilege and a pleasure. And kisses to Kathleen in New York City. You're the best. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day. Jim Masters, thanking you for your time this time. Till next time, right here on the Jim Masters Show Live. Have a good night. Thanks for being with us.